Hello there, and welcome to our channel, where curiosity settles in like an old friend and science takes its time. Never in a hurry, never demanding your full attention all at once. You're safe to relax here. You don't need to keep track of anything. You can just let the thoughts drift where they want to, soft and steady, like they do when a long day finally lets go of its grip. Tonight, we're wandering into a question that sits right on the border between history and imagination. A question that invites you to lean back a little, breathe a little more deeply, and let your mind stretch out into places that don't often get visited in the rush of daily life. Because we're going to wonder something together. Something gentle, something playful, but also something surprisingly grounded. What if Earth's great landmarks weren't just isolated human achievements scattered across continents and separated by thousands of years? What if they were part of a pattern placed by the very first civilization, arranged with a purpose we've forgotten, a message written in stone and soil, before written language even existed? Before we step into that idea, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Maybe it's a quiet room. Maybe it's a dim train car or a warm bed after a long day. Maybe it's sunrise where you are, or perhaps the sky is dark and you're already letting sleep settle behind your eyes. Whatever time it is for you right now, that little detail becomes part of the story because every listener hears this at a different moment. Yet somehow, we all arrive here together. If you find these slow explorations calming or helpful for drifting into rest, or simply easing your thoughts, I'd be grateful if you gave the video a like or subscribed. It helps this cozy corner of Earth reach others who might need a place to unwind, too. Now, take a moment, get comfortable. You don't need to think hard tonight. I'll do the wandering, and you can just follow along at your own pace. Because the idea of a first civilization isn't about conspiracy theories or grand claims. It's about asking how humans made sense of the world long before the familiar chapters of history began. It's about the possibility that our ancestors might have worked with a sense of scale we rarely imagine. A scale that stretched beyond villages, beyond kingdoms, beyond eras. Something that connected landscapes the way we connect constellations in the sky. Even the question itself has a quiet kind of wonder to it. If the earliest builders wanted to tell future generations something too large for words and too permanent for fragile memories, what would they leave for us to find? And would we even recognize it if we were staring straight at it? When we think of Earth's great structures, the mind quickly jumps to the usual examples. The pyramids of Giza standing in the desert like they were waiting for someone to ask the right question. Stonehenge rising from the fields. A circle of stones arranged with an accuracy that still surprises modern engineers. Machu Picchu resting high in the Andes. Carved terraces holding onto the mountain with quiet determination. The Nazca lines stretched across the Peruvian desert in shapes that make sense only from above. The Moai statues of Easter Island watching over their coastline with an expression that feels calm, patient, and unmovable. These places, and so many others, seem like isolated achievements. Different cultures, different eras, different materials, different beliefs. Yet, there is a strange comfort in imagining that maybe, just maybe, these weren't isolated after all. That perhaps the very first civilization, whatever we want to call them, had a way of marking Earth using the land itself as their canvas. Not as magic, not as myth, but as early attempts to understand the world through patterns and placement. If you've ever stood in front of an ancient structure, you know the feeling it carries. The silence, the stillness, the strange familiarity, even when you know nothing about its builders. There's something about these places that makes you feel like you're tapping into a timeline so old, it almost stops feeling like a timeline at all. Just a long continuation of human presence. You can imagine someone thousands of years ago looking at the same stone, running their hand along the same carved edge. You can almost sense their intention, even when the meaning is gone. It's this feeling that makes the idea of a first civilization so compelling. Not because it replaces what we already know, but because it adds a layer of possibility underneath it. A sense that our shared story might be older, wider, or more interconnected than we usually consider. Think of the Earth as one enormous surface, not a collection of borders or nations or regions, but a single stretch of land and water. If someone wanted to send a message across that entire surface, they wouldn't use paper. They wouldn't use writing at all. They would use the land itself. They would place markers. They would carve shapes. They would build stones into formations that don't erode quickly. Structures so large they can be seen long after their makers have disappeared. We still do versions of this today. We send spacecraft with engraved plaques, hoping that someone, somewhere in some distant time, might one day decode the message. We map our own digital constellations using satellites, leaving patterns in the sky instead of in the soil. The impulse to be remembered is old. It's not modern, not ancient, but deeply human. So maybe the first civilization tried the same thing in their own way with whatever tools they had. And when we look at landmarks scattered around the world, it's tempting to imagine threads between them. Not literal threads, but conceptual ones. Alignments with stars, alignments with each other. Alignments that suggest someone cared where these things were placed. The Earth isn't random. Its geography nudges cultures in certain directions. Rivers shape where we live. Mountains draw borders we didn't intend. Coastlines pull us closer to or farther from each other. If you had a civilization that wanted to map the world before maps, they would follow patterns in the land. They would choose sites that meant something, either consciously or because the landscape drew them there. And if their influence lasted long enough, later cultures might reuse those sites without even knowing why they mattered. The reasons dissolve. The stones remain. Sometimes the idea of a first civilization sounds impossible because we imagine it as something advanced, something futuristic, or impossibly old. But it doesn't have to be like that. It might have been a culture that simply had a way of seeing patterns over long distances, something we struggle to do because we mostly live in local scales. We see our towns, our cities, our countries, our immediate surroundings. But imagine if you lived in a world where people traveled far more slowly, yet more attentively. Where journeys took months, but those months carved paths into memory. Where stories spread across continents, not through wires or screens, but by the movement of people themselves. A civilization in that kind of world might notice things we would miss. They might see the Earth as one continuous surface, rather than a collection of separate regions. They might place something on one part of the world knowing that someone else far away might do the same for reasons that feel connected, even if they weren't stated. If you've ever seen a map showing how some ancient sites line up in unexpected ways, you know the strange feeling it gives you. A little spark of recognition, even if you're not sure what you're recognizing. It's not that these alignments prove anything. It's that they invite thought. Why does a certain line drawn across the Earth pass through multiple ancient landmarks? Why do certain structures align with specific stars, not just at one location, but across cultures that had no recorded contact? Why did the earliest builders choose certain latitudes or certain longitudes without knowing those words existed? When you look at enough of these odd consistencies, your mind starts to relax into the idea that something might be there, not as a definitive truth, but as a possibility worth exploring gently without rushing. Tonight's exploration won't try to prove anything. It won't present things as certain or final. Instead, we'll wander through the idea the way you wander through a quiet museum at night, moving from one exhibit to the next at your own pace. You'll hear about patterns that appear when we step back far enough. You'll hear about the ways early humans left their mark on the earth. You'll hear about alignments, choices, shapes, stones, and the reasons they may have been placed where they were. We'll look at the idea from different angles without trying to force it into a single explanation, and each part will guide us softly into the next, so your mind can drift without feeling any pressure to follow every detail. As you listen, you might notice your thoughts slowing down, not because the ideas are heavy, but because there's a calmness in imagining people long ago shaping the earth with nothing but intention, stone, and time. There's something soothing about imagining them working under open skies, watching the same stars we see now. Something steady about imagining the land holding on to their choices for thousands of years. And something grounding in thinking about how we too are trying to leave our own messages behind, whether we realize it or not. Every generation does, every culture does. In one way or another, we're always placing markers for the future. There's a certain moment that happens when you first stand in front of an ancient stone, not a decorative one, not a stone placed in a garden for convenience, but a stone carved or lifted by hands that lived thousands of years before you. You notice its weight long before you touch it. You notice the way it fits into the landscape, not like a random object, but like something that belongs there, as if the land and the stone reached some kind of agreement long ago. People sometimes describe this sensation as a whisper, not because the stone is telling you anything mystical, but because it seems to hold a presence your mind can't quite explain. The air around it feels different. The silence has a texture. And even if you don't know the history, even if you're just standing there with no expectations at all, you can sense that something important happened long before you arrived. This feeling is one of the reasons people sometimes wonder whether the first civilization, if it existed, might have left something behind that wasn't a story, wasn't a tool, and wasn't a piece of technology, but something simpler, something heavy, something grounded, something that could stay in place long after names and languages faded. Because stones don't hurry, they don't rot. They don't carry the fragility of memory. They carry weight. And if early humans were trying to leave information for others, they would have needed a medium that didn't depend on words, something that could last through earthquakes, erosion, migration, war, and the slow forgetting that cultures fall into when time keeps moving. If you imagine the earliest people trying to understand the world, it's easy to picture them looking at the landscape not as a set of obstacles, but as a canvas, not a literal one, just a surface they interacted with. Mountains in the distance framed by the horizon, rivers bending around plains, and large fields where the wind moved predictably. These features guided decisions. They weren't just background scenery. They shaped where people built, rested, traveled, and worked. In that kind of world, placing stones wasn't just an act of engineering. It was a form of communication before communication had rules. A way to mark that something mattered, a way to say, this place is different from the places around it. If the first civilization existed, even in a modest form, it probably didn't think of itself as the first. We do that kind of labeling from the outside, long after everything has happened. At the time, people were simply building what they needed. They weren't imagining themselves as legends or ancestors. They were making choices the way we make choices today, driven by climate, safety, food, community, and a sense of meaning that wasn't written down anywhere. And one of the easiest ways to make a choice visible was to change the land even in a small way. Move a stone, align several stones. Build something tall enough to be seen at a distance. Put something heavy in a spot where no natural force placed it. The more you look at ancient sites, the more you notice how often stones take the center stage. Not always the large ones. Sometimes a set of smaller stones arranged, with care. Sometimes a ring, sometimes a line, sometimes a single monolith that seems to stand alone until you study the distances between it and other features in the environment. The materials vary from region to region: basalt, limestone, sandstone, granite. But the intention feels similar across cultures, as if people understood something that didn't need writing. The land was not just a place to live. It was the map, the memory, and the message. Archaeologists often discuss the idea of intentional placement, that is, whether an arrangement came from organized planning or from simpler habits. But regardless of how complex ancient societies were, intentional placement shows up everywhere. People didn't build randomly. They didn't move heavy stones without a reason. They didn't choose the same alignments repeatedly across different climates by coincidence. When we see patterns appear again and again, patterns that span continents and centuries, it invites us to consider that humans across the world might have been noticing similar things about their surroundings and choosing to mark those things in durable ways. Picture the earliest builders standing in an open field. No cities, no machines, no written plans. Just a community surveying the land, stretching their arms to gauge angles, using the rising and setting of the sun as natural markers, watching the stars at night, not out of mysticism, but because the sky was the most consistent clock they had. These people would have noticed where the horizon dips, where shadows fall, where certain stones naturally appear, and how water shapes the ground over time. If they wanted a structure to last, they would choose a place where the land could support that weight. If they wanted travelers to find it, they would choose a location visible from afar. If they wanted to mark a seasonal event, they would align it with the sun or a star that always returned to the same position at predictable intervals. Now, imagine this, happening not in one place, but in many groups spread across different regions, each interacting with their own environment, each noticing similar patterns, each leaving small markers behind. These markers could be simple at first: a pile of stones, a shaped rock, a clearing made deliberately. Over generations, those markers could grow more elaborate. Stones become aligned, alignments become structures, structures become landmarks, and eventually, those landmarks become stories, myths, symbols, or sacred places, without anyone remembering why they were created to begin with. When the stones begin to whisper, they're not telling us who built them. They're reminding us that someone made a choice. Someone stood where we stand now and decided this exact spot matters. And when enough spots across enough regions show that same kind of intention, it creates the sense that there may have been a thread connecting them, whether through cultural memory, shared practices, or something more foundational that we haven't yet recognized. Many ancient stones appear placed with surprising precision. Stonehenge aligns with sunrise and sunset on specific days of the year. The pyramids align with cardinal directions more accurately than some modern buildings. The megalithic structures in Karnak stretch in long rows that seem too deliberate to be accidental. Temples in Cambodia align with each other across vast distances that cannot be explained by local geography alone. Sites in South America mirror star patterns seen from far above. These aren't isolated anomalies. They repeat so often that researchers still debate whether the alignments were intentional or whether we're simply noticing patterns because humans are good at finding meaning. But even if some patterns are coincidences, not all of them can be. The more you study ancient placements, the harder it becomes to assume randomness. At minimum, these builders understood geometry. They understood repetition. They understood long-term thinking. They understood that stones weren't just convenient materials. Stones were archives. Stones were markers that outlived the people who placed them. Stones were reliable even when stories changed. If a first civilization wanted to preserve knowledge, stones would have been the perfect medium. Not carvings that erode quickly, not symbols that require literacy, but placements, angles, distances, patterns created with intention and meant to be recognized only when someone had the patience to step back and look at everything at once. Most people see ancient sites individually. They see one structure, read its plaque, walk around, take a picture, and leave. But if you shift your perspective, if you look at these sites as parts of a larger set, the landscape begins to take on a different quality. You start noticing similarities in orientation. You start seeing repeated arrangements of circles, squares, and triangles. You start recognizing that certain latitudes hold clusters of ancient structures while others are curiously empty. And sometimes when you draw lines between these sites, not arbitrary ones, but lines that follow alignments built into the structures themselves, you find connections that make you pause. Why would builders separated by oceans choose similar angles to the horizon? Why would they repeatedly mark solstices and equinoxes? Why would stones be placed in ways that align with distant landmarks, impossible to see from the ground? These questions don't require supernatural answers. They simply require the acknowledgement that early humans were observant. They paid attention to the land, the sky, the cycles, and the patterns. And if they shared that attention long enough across many generations, they could have created a network of aligned markers without ever meeting each other directly. When the stones begin to whisper, they are telling us to slow down, to look more closely, to notice that the earliest people didn't build quickly or casually. They built with time as a collaborator. They were patient in ways we rarely experience today. A structure that took decades to build wasn't a burden to them. It was a way to shape the world in a form that could be passed down. If the first civilization placed the earliest stones, they weren't thinking about tourism or glory. They were thinking about permanence, about the land as something that could hold memory when people could not. As you imagine those first builders, consider the scale of their commitment. To move even a small megalith without machines requires time, coordination, and purpose. To place it accurately requires repeated observations. To align it with other structures hundreds of kilometers away requires a shared understanding of how to measure and navigate across landscapes without written maps. None of this demands advanced technology. It requires consistency, patience, and a worldview in which the land itself is the medium for long-term knowledge. And if this kind of thinking existed, even in a small way, it wouldn't just affect one region. It would influence every group that inherited even a fraction of that mindset. You could have a civilization that placed the earliest markers, then disappeared. But the idea of marking the land would remain. Later, societies would build their own structures on top of or near those earlier sites, guided by traditions whose origins they had forgotten. Over time, the original purpose would fade, but the pattern would persist. Not because of direct connection, but because ideas can outlast the people who first invented them. Tonight, as we explore this idea further, we won't assume anything mystical. We won't assume anything improbable. We'll follow the thought gently, the way you follow a path through a quiet forest. There's no need to rush to conclusions. There's no need to force a story into a shape it doesn't naturally take. We're simply examining how humans interact with the land when they want to be remembered. And stones, silent as they are, make excellent messengers. When people look at ancient structures, they often see only what's in front of them: a ring of stones, a line of pillars, a pyramid rising from the desert, a temple that once held ceremonies, a statue carved with care. Each of these things feels complete on its own, like a single idea made visible. They have boundaries, shapes, and purposes that seem self-contained. But when you look at enough of them, when you place them side by side in your mind or on a map, something curious begins to happen. They stop looking like isolated accomplishments and start looking like pieces of a wider arrangement, pieces that might connect to other pieces far away. The kinds of connections that only appear when you step back, not in distance, but in scale. The human mind is tuned for small patterns. We're excellent at noticing the arrangement of objects in a room. We see the logic in a row of trees along a path. We can tell if something in our local environment is out of place. But when patterns stretch much farther across landscapes, across continents, across generations, they become harder to see. They're too large for everyday thinking, too broad to grasp in a single moment. And because the people who built these structures lived in different times, different cultures, and different environments, we assume their work has nothing to do with each other. We divide history into chapters, separate civilizations, separate origins. It helps organize things, but it also makes it harder to imagine that some patterns might cross those boundaries in ways we didn't expect. If a first civilization left markers across the world, those markers wouldn't be obvious up close. You wouldn't see a sign saying, "This is part of a global pattern." You'd just see a structure and whatever story survived around it. But if you zoomed out, really zoomed out, the markers might begin to line up in ways that feel deliberate. Not in a decorative way, not in a mystical way, but in a way that suggests early humans weren't just building for local reasons. They were responding to something larger, something consistent, something that turned the entire Earth into a surface they could measure over time. Consider the idea of alignment. Many ancient structures are aligned with the sun during specific events. Sunrise on the solstice, sunset on the equinox, the return of a particular star at dawn. These alignments appear in Egypt, Britain, Cambodia, Peru, Mexico, India, Polynesia, and in places where written records are scarce or non-existent. The structures aren't identical, but the intention is similar. Aligning with the sky requires stepping back from daily life and noticing slower rhythms. It requires thinking in cycles. It requires paying attention to the horizon and the movement of celestial bodies across it. And once a group learns to track these patterns, they gain the ability to create markers that carry meaning across distances. Imagine a group of early humans traveling over generations. They follow rivers, coastlines, and animal migrations. Along the way, they build stones or earthworks aligned with the same celestial event they recognized at home. Not because they're sending messages to distant cultures, but because they're recording something familiar in every unfamiliar place. If this behavior continues long enough, and if the descendants of these people continue building in the same style, you end up with a chain of structures that seem related even when separated by thousands of years and thousands of kilometers. Stepping back even farther, you begin to notice that many ancient sites occupy similar latitudes. Some align along the 30th parallel, others cluster around the 15th. Others follow coastlines that were once lower during past ice ages. It's easy to dismiss this as coincidence until you look at how often these parallels hold clusters of structures compared to regions just slightly north or south. Why would so many builders across eras, across continents, choose similar bands of Earth? It might be environmental, it might be survival, it might be trade routes, or it might be that the earliest people to build anything at all already had reasons to choose those bands. Reasons inherited by those who came later without remembering where the idea started. When you start examining distances between landmarks, more patterns emerge. Some structures sit almost exactly the same distance apart, even though their builders never met. Some form triangles with other distant sites that share consistent angles. Others align with mountain ranges or fault lines in ways that suggest a careful reading of the landscape. The more of these details you gather, the more the possibility arises that ancient builders weren't just placing structures randomly. They were responding to something that spanned distances beyond any one culture, something that made the Earth itself the reference point. If you've ever looked at a world map of ancient sites, you'll notice that many of them cluster around coastlines that would have existed before sea levels rose. Archaeologists know that during the last ice age, coastlines were much farther out. Entire regions now underwater were once dry land. It's possible that early humans, especially any group that could be considered a foundational civilization, lived in these regions. If they built anything at all, those structures might now be submerged. And if those structures influenced later cultures as they migrated inland, the patterns they created might continue on land in ways that seem disconnected until you look at the entire picture. Stepping back doesn't just reveal patterns in placement, it reveals patterns in intention. Across the world, early builders seem to share a desire to mark seasons, track celestial movements, and orient structures in consistent ways. In regions that never interacted through seas, trade, we see circles, causeways, mounds, pyramids, terraces, and alignments shaped by similar principles. This doesn't imply a single global culture working in perfect coordination. It suggests that early humans everywhere responded to the same challenges: how to measure time, how to preserve knowledge, how to navigate without written instructions, how to leave something behind that future generations could read without words. If the first civilization existed, even in a small and scattered form, its most lasting contribution might not have been a city or a language. It might have been a way of thinking, a habit of marking the land, a belief that certain locations mattered more than others. These ideas can travel farther than people. They can persist long after the reasons are forgotten. A group might remember a story about a sacred hill without knowing the story's origin. They might build a structure oriented toward a star without knowing why. They might follow a route marked by older markers without questioning who placed the first one. The power of stepping back lies in recognizing that continuity can exist without direct communication. A pattern doesn't require a worldwide plan. It just requires enough people noticing similar things, preserving similar habits, and passing them down through generations. Over time, those habits create a map that stretches far wider than any single community could fully understand. Think of it the way you think of a flock of birds. Each bird follows simple rules. Keep a certain distance from your neighbor. Follow the general direction of the flock. Don't collide. No single bird plans the shape of the group. Yet the group forms patterns that look deliberate. Patterns that make sense only when seen from far away. Patterns too big for any individual bird to understand. Human civilizations, especially early ones, might behave in similar ways. Each group made local choices based on similar needs and similar observations. But when you look at the collective result, the pattern feels larger than any single group intended. Now imagine that somewhere at the beginning of this long sequence, a group existed that had a little more time, a little more stability, and a little more interest in marking the land. They didn't need to be technologically advanced. They just needed to think in longer cycles than most of their peers. They needed to observe carefully. They needed to build steadily. If they created early markers, even simple ones, those markers could have influenced routes, settlement patterns, and building habits for thousands of years. The markers could have been modified, rebuilt, enlarged, or replicated by later groups. Over time, the original purpose would fade, but the shape of the pattern would remain. A pattern too large to see unless you step far enough back. One of the most striking examples of this large-scale thinking appears in the Nazca lines. The shapes stretch across kilometers, visible only from high above. The people who made them didn't have aircraft, yet they created enormous designs, as if they intended someone at a higher vantage point to understand them. Some researchers propose that the lines were ceremonial paths. Others suggest they were astronomical markers. Others say they were agricultural calendars. But regardless of interpretation, the creators weren't thinking in meters. They were thinking in kilometers. They were thinking on a scale that demanded stepping back mentally, if not physically. Similar scale thinking appears in the layout of the pyramids at Giza, which mirror certain stars. It appears in the network of temples in Cambodia, which stretch across the landscape in patterns recognizable only from above. It appears in the mound complexes of North America, some of which align across distances too large to appreciate on foot. These aren't identical achievements, but they share a willingness to work with the land at scales larger than daily human life. If you were part of a first civilization trying to leave something behind that would survive the passing of time, you wouldn't choose fragile materials. You wouldn't choose small objects. You would choose the landscape. You would shape it in ways that persist. You would build with stone, earth, and placement. And you would trust that even if your culture vanished, future people might notice some part of what you did, even if the full meaning disappeared. Stepping back reveals that many ancient sites appear in clusters linked by geography. River valleys hold chains of structures. Mountain ridges hold sequences of lookout points. Shorelines hold repeated forms of early monuments. These patterns could be purely practical. Humans settle near water. They build near stable land. They choose defensible positions. But sometimes the clusters don't follow these practical lines. Sometimes they align with each other across regions where there is no environmental reason for consistency. In those cases, stepping back becomes the only way to understand why the pattern exists at all. If you were to draw a map of every ancient site older than a certain age and then gradually zoom out, you might notice shapes emerging. Not mystical shapes, not deliberate drawings, just consistent tendencies. People choosing similar angles, people repeating similar ratios, people marking similar celestial events. These patterns don't prove a single origin, but they invite curiosity about whether some early influence sets certain habits in motion. A key part of stepping back is recognizing that humans have always struggled with wide scales. We're excellent at noticing small patterns. Large ones escape us unless we make a deliberate effort to see them. It's only in the last few decades, with digital mapping and satellite imagery, that we can look at the world the way birds or high-altitude travelers might see it. And now that we have that perspective, patterns once invisible are now easier to detect. If ancient humans had thought in large patterns but had no way to see them from above, their work might look disconnected to us today. But if their intentions were consistent, even without aerial views, the patterns would still exist. When you step back from individual sites and look at the global picture, you begin to notice that ancient builders weren't simply expressing culture. They were interacting with the planet itself, using it as a guide, using it as a reference, using it as a durable medium. And if that idea began somewhere early in human history, perhaps among the very first people to settle in stable communities and build permanent markers, then the influence of that idea might still be visible today, even if the names of the people behind it are permanently lost. When we talk about ancient structures, we usually focus on what stands above the ground: towers, pillars, stones, walls, entrances, the parts we can see, the parts that catch the light, the parts tourists photograph. But much of what early builders cared about wasn't above the ground at all. It was the placement itself, the position, the angle, the orientation decisions made long before the first stone was lifted. Decisions that don't look like anything at first glance, because they're not built upward, they're built outward, and downward. They're built into the earth, not on top of it. They form a kind of geometry that doesn't announce itself loudly. It sits quietly beneath every visible structure, shaping the entire site before the structure even exists. This kind of geometry is easy to overlook because it doesn't feel like construction. It feels like planning, and planning doesn't leave obvious ruins. But when you study enough ancient sites, you notice something consistent. People were not placing things randomly. They were not pushing stones around without thought. They were not building wherever they happened to stand. They were choosing specific locations and orienting those locations with care, often in ways we only understand after we measure them. What stays hidden until we step back far enough or look closely enough is the underlying system that guided those placements, the silent geometry that sits beneath our feet. If a first civilization ever existed, or even a set of early groups with shared habits, this geometry might have been their most important contribution. Patterns carved into the land at scales too large to see directly, distances measured without measuring tapes, angles repeated across continents, ratios preserved through oral tradition, not written instruction. People didn't need to call it geometry to use it. They didn't need to draw diagrams or write equations. They only needed to repeat actions that worked. Over time, those actions formed regularities, and those regularities are still visible in where things stand today. Take the idea of cardinal directions, for example. Many ancient sites are aligned precisely to north, south, east, and west. This accuracy often surpasses what wooden tools or simple observation should allow, yet site after site points the same way. The Great Pyramid aligns to true north within a fraction of a degree. Stone circles in Europe match solar events that repeat precisely every year. Temples in Mexico orient themselves to the sunrise or sunset with remarkable consistency. These details aren't accidents. They're choices made by people who observed the sky long enough to understand how the earth moves beneath it. These choices show a level of attention that makes you wonder how widespread this knowledge was. And it's not just about directions, it's about distances. When researchers begin measuring the spacing between ancient sites, they sometimes find consistent intervals. It might be a certain number of kilometers between structures of similar type. It might be repeating ratios between distances across landscapes. It might be patterns that emerge only when many sites are plotted on a map. These patterns don't have to be precise down to the meter to be intentional. They only need to be consistent enough that they're unlikely to be chance. And more often than not, the spacing hints at people who understood how to measure land in ways that were portable and teachable. Imagine a group that uses pacing as a measuring tool. They walk the land, counting steps, comparing distances to familiar routes. Over time, they develop a sense for long distances. They know where the horizons shift. They know where the land rises or dips. They know how far the sun travels across the sky each day and how shadows behave throughout the year. With enough repetition, they begin making decisions based on these observations. They mark certain spots. They return to them. Their children return to them. Eventually, those spots become the foundation for construction. The geometry is there long before anyone lifts a stone. The earth itself shapes this geometry. That's something we often forget. Geography influences where people live, travel, rest, hunt, and farm. Rivers become natural lines of movement. Coastlines become borders. Mountain ranges become guides. People who walk these landscapes regularly develop a spatial awareness that's difficult to grasp from modern perspectives. Today, we rely on maps, satellites, and GPS. Early humans relied on memory, repetition, and the natural rhythms of their environment. That kind of reliance creates patterns almost automatically. Patterns that would look geometric if you traced them long after the fact, even if they began as practical habits. But sometimes the geometry is more specific than simple environmental shaping. Consider the shapes of early settlements. Many ancient villages follow circular or rectangular layouts, not in a decorative sense, but in a practical one. Circles allow equal access to the center. Rectangles make it easy to allocate space. Over time, these shapes appear in ceremonial sites as well, not because the builders read geometry textbooks, but because these shapes solved problems efficiently. If repeated long enough, these shapes become cultural habits. Habits become traditions. Traditions become expected forms, and expected forms appear around the world, even in cultures that never contacted each other. Yet, the most striking part of the silent geometry beneath ancient structures isn't the shapes themselves. It's the decision to place these structures in relation to something else, something beyond the immediate settlement, something that often lies miles or even hundreds of miles away. Many ancient builders aligned their structures with distant mountains, rivers, or horizon points. They weren't just marking the local environment, they were mapping the larger one. These alignments suggest an understanding of a land on scales far wider than daily life would require. And when you see these alignments repeat across the world, the question becomes not whether people were capable of such thinking, but whether they learned it from earlier sources. Picture someone standing in a wide plain thousands of years ago. There are no buildings yet, no survey tools, no city plans, just a person observing the land. They watch where the sun rises in summer and where it rises in winter. They watch how shadows stretch at noon and how they shorten throughout the year. They notice the highest point on the horizon and the lowest. They see where water gathers after rain and where the land remains dry. Over years of observation, they begin to understand that certain spots behave differently than others. They might choose a spot for a structure because it sits at the intersection of natural lines, lines visible only to people who spend long hours paying attention. This attention is the root of early geometry. It doesn't come from formulas, it comes from familiarity. And when many people across many generations share that familiarity, they begin to mark the places that stand out. A hill that aligns with a solstice sunrise, a valley where shadows meet perfectly at noon, a ridge that points toward a distant landmark. These markers don't need to be impressive. The geometry behind them exists even before the markers do. People simply recognize something consistent and choose to emphasize it. Modern researchers sometimes refer to geospatial coherence. It means that certain types of structures appear in locations that share specific characteristics. Archaeologists debate whether this coherence arises from shared cultural exchange or from independent discovery of similar solutions. But the coherence itself is undeniable. When hundreds of structures across the Earth exhibit similar placements relative to the horizon or the cardinal directions, it becomes difficult to describe it as coincidence. It suggests that people everywhere were responding to the same signals, even if they didn't know others were doing the same. If the first civilization existed, even in a modest coastal environment now lost to changing sea levels, its understanding of the land could have provided the starting points for these habits. The people who learned from them might not have known the origins, but the practices could have spread slowly across migrating populations. A group moves inland carrying the habit of marking solstices. Another moves across a river carrying the habit of orienting dwellings to the east. Another travels along a coastline carrying the habit of aligning structures in specific ratios to natural features. Over centuries, these habits become embedded in distant cultures without anyone realizing they share a root. One of the more intriguing aspects of silent geometry is the use of simple shapes that repeat across the world. Triangles formed by distances between landmarks, right angles between walls and causeways, symmetrical arrangements of stones, ratios that approximate well-known geometric relationships long before written mathematics existed. It doesn't require advanced knowledge to create these shapes. It only requires observation and repetition. But when these shapes appear across continents separated by oceans, it raises the question of whether early humans had a shared sense of structure inherited from even earlier traditions. This doesn't imply a grand design. It doesn't imply intentional global planning. It suggests the possibility that once humans learned to mark the land with purpose, that purpose became a kind of language. Not a spoken language, but a spatial one. A language that used placement instead of words. A language that could survive long after stories faded. A language that remains visible today, even though we no longer remember how to read it fully. Think about how children learn to draw shapes. They draw circles, squares, and lines, not because they understand geometry, but because those shapes are intuitive. Early humans were similar in the landscape. They created arrangements that felt intuitive. They repeated them over thousands of years. Those arrangements shaped the placement of entire settlements and monuments. The silent geometry beneath ancient sites is like a foundation of human thought, made visible only when you step far enough back to see the patterns repeat. There's also the idea of natural geometry. The Earth itself contains repeating patterns. Fault lines often run in straight or gently curving paths. Rivers bend in predictable ways. Mountain ranges create long ridges and distinct angles. Early humans who traveled widely would have learned these patterns. They might not have described them mathematically, but they would have recognized them. They would have learned to place markers in spots that stood out from their surroundings, perhaps because those spots lay on natural intersections of geological lines. If they built repeatedly in these places, the pattern would echo across generations and continents without anyone needing to coordinate across long distances. As we explore more examples, we'll see how this silent geometry, once recognized, affects the way we think about the past. It invites us to imagine that the earliest builders weren't just shaping their surroundings. They were responding to a logic built into the land. A logic they may not have fully understood, but one they respected enough to follow. And when that logic becomes visible to us today, even faintly, it feels as though we're glimpsing something humans once understood instinctively. Tonight, we're not trying to solve anything final. We're not trying to draw sweeping conclusions. We're simply acknowledging that beneath every ancient structure, there is an unseen framework, a set of decisions made long before construction, a network of choices that hints at continuity, stretching farther back than any single culture remembers. When you look at a single ancient site, it's easy to treat it as a closed story, a monument built by one group of people for reasons rooted in their own environment, their own beliefs, their own needs. You might walk around it, learn a few details, and leave with the impression that its meaning begins and ends right there. But when you start placing several of these sites onto a map spread across continents, separated by deserts, oceans, forests, or entire eras, something else starts to appear. They no longer look like individual statements. They begin to resemble points in a larger conversation, a conversation that unfolds across the planet, slow and steady, shaped not by words, but by placement. This doesn't mean that ancient builders were coordinating across great distances. There's no evidence that people in one region were sending instructions to another, but it does suggest that certain habits, certain observations, and certain intentions were shared widely, whether through migration, long-term memory, or repeated discovery of the same practical solutions. And when you step back far enough, the result looks almost as if the landmarks are responding to one another, acknowledging each other across the earth in ways that don't require direct contact to appear consistent. Imagine standing at Stonehenge and knowing nothing about its history, then traveling to the pyramids of Giza with the same lack of context. At each site, the stones or structures feel uniquely rooted in their surroundings. Yet, both places encode celestial alignments. Both involve careful orientation. Both follow repeated patterns. It's like two people writing different letters in different languages. Yet, both letters begin with the same greeting out of habit. That habit persists even when the languages don't match. And when seen together, it creates the sense that the writers understood something similar about communication without having ever met. Many early landmarks share traits that serve as this kind of greeting. Alignments with solstices, alignments with cardinal directions, shapes constructed from predictable geometric principles, proportions that reflect repeated ratios, distances that appear intentional rather than accidental. When you map these traits across many locations, it's as if the landmarks are speaking in the same structural language. Not a spoken language, but a language based on orientation and placement, one that remains readable if you know how to look. Let's consider distances for a moment, because distance is one of the simplest ways landmarks could reflect a shared understanding of the land. If two sites are placed a certain number of kilometers apart, and that same distance appears again between other sites, it's unlikely to be coincidence if the pattern repeats enough times. Some researchers have noticed that certain megalithic structures across Europe and North Africa sit at intervals that approximate whole number multiples of a shared baseline distance. Whether or not this baseline was known consciously, the consistency suggests that people were marking land in ways that created predictable spacing. They may have been following routes shaped by rivers or coastlines. They may have been pacing distances using inherited measures. They may have simply been repeating a habit without remembering why it began. If a first civilization existed, even in a small coastal region long ago, their earliest markers might have served as reference points that shaped migration routes. When people follow familiar paths over generations, those paths become stable. When those paths are stable, certain distances naturally repeat. And when new groups establish their own structures, they often build near older markers, either because the spot is geographically advantageous or because they perceive some value in the location, even if the original meaning is forgotten. Over time, this produces lines of sites that seem to acknowledge each other across long distances. One of the clearest examples of this kind of long-distance coherence appears in the placement of sites relative to bodies of water. Many ancient monuments sit along coastlines that existed during earlier climate periods. When sea levels rose, these coastlines shifted, but the pattern of placement remains visible inland. If you follow these patterns, you find strings of landmarks that appear aligned with coastlines that no longer exist. This suggests that early humans might have used water as a primary navigation tool and placed structures at regular intervals along shorelines. When people later moved inland, the habit of spacing structures at predictable distances may have followed them. From a modern perspective, it creates a chain of sites that seem to speak to each other across changing landscapes. Then, there's the matter of orientation. Even if the distances between landmarks differ, their orientations can reveal connections. Many ancient sites face the same direction relative to the horizon. A structure in Central America might face the same solstice sunrise as one in Europe. Even though the two cultures had fond no interaction, this shared orientation doesn't imply contact. It implies that the same environmental observations were important to both groups. And if early humans across multiple regions paid attention to the same horizon events, they would naturally align their structures in similar ways. The result is a planet scattered with landmarks that look like they're communicating through direction rather than distance. Some sites even seem to point toward each other unintentionally. A temple in one region might be oriented toward the rising sun at a certain time of year, and that same orientation might happen to align with another ancient site lying far away along the same path. If enough sites exhibit this pattern, It's as though they're forming lines across the Earth. These lines aren't perfectly straight. They bend with the curvature of the planet, but when plotted on maps, they create patterns that appear deliberate. Not because the builders coordinated with each other, but because they were all responding to the same consistent reference point: the sky. When you combine these factors, distance, orientation, spacing, and environmental alignment, the sense that landmarks talk to each other becomes stronger. They're not communicating through intention, they're communicating through consistency, through the habits of human beings who learned to observe the world carefully and pass those observations down long after the reasons faded. Another form of silent conversation between landmarks comes from their placement relative to natural features. Some structures line up with mountain peaks visible from great distances. Others align with valleys, ridges, or specific geological formations. These natural alignments repeat across regions, suggesting that early humans followed similar logic when deciding where to place long-lasting markers. If a structure aligns with a distant mountain that rises clearly on the horizon, and another structure hundreds of kilometers away does the same with a mountain of similar shape, the result is a pattern that stretches across the land. Each landmark acknowledges a natural feature, and in doing so, acknowledges the logic behind similar landmarks elsewhere. These connections become even more intriguing when structures appear in pairs or series. Consider how some ancient sites are built as part of groups rather than as solitary monuments. A central structure might be surrounded by smaller ones, each oriented in a specific direction. Similar groupings appear around the world. They're not identical in design, but the arrangement of central and peripheral markers follows patterns that repeat. This repetition makes it easier to imagine that early humans developed templates for organizing space, templates that spread slowly across generations. If these templates originated early in human history, perhaps influenced by a particularly stable or long-lasting culture, they could explain why later structures in distant regions seem to share organizational logic. The builders weren't imitating each other. They were following inherited methods that made sense for marking land and time. There's also the way different types of landmarks interact. Not all ancient structures serve the same functions. Some are ceremonial, some are agricultural, some are astronomical, but their placements often reflect a shared understanding of the land. For example, a ritual site might align with a natural boundary, and a burial site miles away might align with the same boundary at a different angle. The structures don't interact directly, yet they both acknowledge the same environmental feature. When you plot these acknowledgements across regions, the pattern resembles a network of landmarks that recognize the same set of rules even without interacting. This network becomes more visible when you examine how some sites appear near intersections of multiple alignments. This structure might sit at the point where one line of solar alignment crosses another, formed by the positions of distant hills. These intersections rarely happen by accident. They suggest that early builders understood how certain places naturally drew connections. When multiple environmental lines converge, the location becomes a natural choice for a marker. If builders across regions noticed similar intersections in their own landscapes, they might have built at these convergence points for reasons unique to their culture, but consistent in method. This consistency makes the landmarks feel as though they're part of a shared conversation, even when they're isolated geographically. The idea that landmarks communicate becomes even more compelling when considering how some ancient structures appear to respond to earlier ones. Later cultures often built near older sites. Sometimes they built directly on top of them. Sometimes they built slightly to the side, aligning their new structures with the older ones. In doing so, they preserved the orientation of the earlier site, even if the original meaning had been lost. It's a form of communication across time rather than distance. A dialogue between generations rather than continents. The later builders weren't speaking to the original makers, but they were acknowledging the placement choices, maintaining the geometry, preserving the alignment. This creates a chain of interpretations, each one built on top of the last. If a first civilization placed early markers, even simple ones, those markers might have shaped the choices of countless later groups, not because the later groups understood the original meaning, but because the locations carried advantages, significance, or familiarity that persisted through memory and tradition. Over thousands of years, these inherited behaviors accumulate into patterns that stretch so far that the structures seem to be acknowledging each other across time. There's also the matter of visibility. Early humans needed landmarks for navigation. A structure visible from a distance becomes a reference point. If multiple groups over time use the same reference points, they might build new markers along the same lines of travel. These markers then form a chain that connects distant regions through accumulated placement choices. When you look at this chain on a map, it resembles a dialogue between sites, each one acknowledging the next through proximity and purpose. Sometimes the communication is symbolic rather than practical. A culture might build a structure in a way that resembles another distant structure, not as a direct imitation, but because the same shapes or proportions carry meaning. If early humans developed shared symbolic shapes, triangles, circles, stepped forms, those shapes might appear in later structures around the world because they fulfill similar needs. The repetition of form can make the structures look related even when they're not. It's a conversation of ideas rather than origins, but result feels similar. The idea of landmarks talking to each other doesn't mean there was a hidden message embedded in the layout of ancient sites. It means that human behavior, repeated consistently across generations and environments, creates patterns that resemble a long-running exchange. When you view each structure as part of a larger pattern, it becomes easier to see how early humans were making sense of their world through placement. They were building in ways that responded to natural, celestial, and spatial cues that transcend any single culture. The more you observe these patterns, the more the idea of a first civilization becomes a matter of influence rather than direct involvement. Early humans, who built with purpose, shaped the habits of those who came after them. Those habits spread through migration. They persisted through tradition. They evolved into new forms while preserving their underlying logic over thousands of years. This creates a world where landmarks reflect shared principles, even when the cultures behind them never interacted. As soon as people begin noticing that ancient landmarks seem to acknowledge one another across landscapes, a deeper question naturally follows. How far do these acknowledgements stretch? How much of the world's oldest architecture participates in patterns that extend beyond local needs or cultural boundaries? Because once you begin tracing alignments across regions, across continents, and sometimes across hemispheres, you find that many ancient structures sit along lines that don't make sense until you step back far enough. Lines that seem too neat to be accidental, too persistent to ignore, and too widespread to belong to any single culture. These patterns are often referred to as alignment mysteries. They involve more than just directions or distances. They involve the relationships between multiple locations, relationships that hold their shape regardless of who built the structures or when they were built. They can be measured, observed, and tested. Yet, they don't always come with explanations. The builders left no written notes about why certain structures point toward distant places. They left no maps pointing out the lines we see now, but the lines exist anyway, embedded in the placement of monuments that were never meant to be examined from satellites or modern mapping tools. The question isn't whether these alignments are real. Many have been measured with precise instruments and confirmed repeatedly. The question is, why they appear so often? Why do so many monuments around the world share orientations that connect naturally to one another? Why do some of these alignments stretch thousands of kilometers and still maintain a level of consistency that would be difficult to achieve even today without modern surveying equipment? And why do so many of the earlier structures appear to fall along routes that follow not only celestial rhythms, but also the curvature of the Earth itself? This doesn't require any idea of ancient global coordination. It requires only that early humans were responding to consistent cues provided by the natural world and repeated across generations. If a first civilization existed and passed down certain habits, those habits might have influenced how later groups placed their structures, even if those groups never knew where the habits began. Over time, a simple set of placement principles becomes a global pattern, not by design, but by repetition. Take the idea of solstice alignments. Many ancient structures face the rising or setting sun during the solstices or equinoxes. This phenomenon occurs in Egypt, Britain, Ireland, Cambodia, China, Peru, Mexico, and many other regions. Each group of builders learned to track the sun's position independently. Yet, the alignments they produced resemble one another because the solar events they marked are universal. The sun rises at the same angle everywhere on Earth, depending on latitude. It moves along the horizon in predictable ways. Early humans who observed these movements would naturally use them as reference points. When you plot these solstice-aligned structures on a map, patterns emerge. Lines appear that follow latitudes or connect locations where builders paid careful attention to the horizon. These lines don't require coordination to form. They simply reflect consistent choices. But when the lines stretch across deserts and oceans, they feel intentional. And even though we know the builders weren't working together directly, their shared reliance on the sun's movement creates a global network of structures facing similar directions. Another alignment mystery involves cardinal directions. Many ancient structures align precisely to true north, south, east, and west. This doesn't seem impressive until you realize how difficult it is to determine true north without modern tools. Magnetic north shifts over time. The position of the stars changes over millennia. Yet, the builders of certain structures achieved a level of accuracy comparable to modern engineering. The Great Pyramid, for example, faces true north with astonishing precision. Other structures around the world share the same accuracy. Even though the cultures behind them had no recorded contact, to align something perfectly to true north, early humans needed to observe the sky carefully and repeatedly. They might have tracked the movement of stars, noting where they rose and set. They might have used shadow length throughout the year to determine the point where the sun's movement reached its extremes. Whatever method they used, they repeated it often enough that structures from distant regions face nearly identical directions. The result is a pattern that unites these structures across long distances through orientation alone. When you combine solar alignments with cardinal alignments, things grow even more interesting. Some ancient sites include features aligned to the solstice sunrise, as well as to the cardinal directions. This dual orientation requires even more careful planning. And when multiple sites across the world display the same combination, it suggests that early builders were not simply marking seasonal events. They were working with a system that treated the horizon as a reliable reference and the Earth as a whole as something worth measuring. This system becomes clearer when you examine alignments that connect specific sites to each other. Some researchers have traced lines running through multiple ancient structures that seem too precise to be accidental. A line drawn from one site passes directly through one or more additional sites not near them, through them, and each site along the line shares some common trait: orientation, shape, alignment, or proximity to a particular latitude. The difficulty is in determining whether these alignments are intentional or coincidental. When you have many sites, some lines will form by chance. But when lines appear that connect structures known for precise orientation, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss. If 3 or more structures lie along a straight path that follows a great circle route across the Earth's surface, it suggests that early builders were choosing locations according to consistent spatial principles. For such a line to exist, the builders of each site didn't need to know about the others. They only needed to follow the same method for choosing locations. If early humans used the same horizon events or the same measurement strategies, their sites might naturally fall along similar routes. And if a first civilization developed these strategies early in human history, the influence could persist for thousands of years before the original source disappeared. We also find alignments involving distances between sites. Some ancient structures sit at distances that appear to match simple geometric ratios when compared to other sites. For example, one site might lie exactly twice as far from a central point as another. Another might fall at a location that forms a right triangle when connected to 2 other structures. These geometric relationships don't prove anything alone, but when they appear repeatedly across the world, they suggest that early builders were using ratios or proportions that felt natural to them. People today might not consider ratios like 1:2 or 3:4 to be meaningful outside of mathematics. But for early humans who learned through practical measurement, these ratios could have been intuitive. They might have been passed down orally or through repeated actions. They might have been discovered independently by different groups because they solved problems efficiently. And when used consistently across generations, they create alignments that persist long after the original builders are gone. Some of the most interesting alignment mysteries involve structures that connect to natural features. For example, a monument might align with a distant mountain peak. Another structure built by a different culture far away might align with its own horizon feature at the same angle or the same azimuth. From a modern standpoint, these similarities create the impression that the structures are oriented toward one another. They're not, but they are oriented according to the same natural cues. And when multiple structures across the world respond to similar cues, the cumulative effect is a global pattern of alignments that seems coordinated, even though it arises from local decisions. This idea becomes especially compelling when considering ancient navigation. Early humans relied heavily on the horizon, the stars, and predictable celestial movements to understand their position. If they learned consistent ways to track these cues, those methods might have shaped their building choices. They might have chosen locations along routes that followed certain latitudes or certain star paths. They might have used the same seasonal indicators to determine when to begin construction. These consistent practices can lead to alignments across large distances, even without direct communication. It's also important to consider how human migration patterns contributed to alignment mysteries. People moved slowly over generations, carrying habits with them. If a group used a particular horizon event to orient their structures, they might have continued doing so long after leaving their original homeland. Over time, these habits could spread widely. Later cultures might inherit the orientation methods without knowing where they came from. And as these methods spread, they leave a trail of structures that share common alignments. This raises an interesting possibility. Instead of a single worldwide alignment system, what if early humans developed multiple systems based on similar observations? For example, many cultures align structures to the rising sun at certain times of the year. Others align structures to specific stars. Others align structures to landforms. The combination of these practices creates patterns that stretch across the world. The patterns don't need to come from a single source to appear connected. They simply need to reflect consistent human responses to the natural environment. Sometimes the alignments are so precise that they challenge our assumptions about ancient capabilities. For instance, some structures align with the Earth's equator or with specific latitudes, despite being built long before modern tools could measure such things accurately. How did early humans determine their latitude? How did they maintain consistent orientation across long distances? These questions don't require advanced technology to answer. People who observe the sun's highest point in the sky, or the angle of specific stars, could determine approximate latitude through repeated observation. A group that practiced this method consistently over generations might pass the technique along long before it was formalized in writing. But what makes many of these alignment mysteries so compelling is that they involve subtlety. The precision is often close but not perfect. The alignments hold up over long distances but allow for small variations. This suggests that the builders weren't using precise tools but were relying on practical observation. It also suggests that the patterns were created organically rather than through a single coordinated effort. The most interesting part of these global patterns comes from how they encourage a different way of thinking about early humans. Instead of imagining isolated groups working independently, these patterns invite the possibility that humans shared fundamental ways of interacting with the environment, not through deliberate collaboration, but through shared experience, through the natural cues the Earth provides, through repeated habits and inherited methods. If a first civilization played any role at all in these alignment mysteries, it may not have been through direct instruction. It may have been through establishing early examples that others later imitated or built upon. The earliest markers, even if simple, might have influenced migration routes or settlement patterns. And once these early choices set a precedent, later groups built in ways that reinforced the patterns without knowing their origins. When people imagine early humans building the first long-lasting structures, they often picture small groups working within the boundaries of their immediate surroundings. A village here, a gathering place there, perhaps a ceremonial site built when a community had the time and resources to work on something beyond daily survival. But the more we study ancient architecture, the more it becomes clear that many early builders were thinking in scales that reached far beyond the visible horizon. They weren't simply arranging stones to solve local needs. They were placing structures in ways that suggest they saw the land as something that extended far beyond their village or settlement. They were aware of distances that couldn't be walked in a day. They were aware of directions that didn't change with terrain. They were aware of celestial movements that repeated no matter where they stood. And these consistent observations allowed them to think in terms that resemble primitive versions of maps, not drawn maps, but spatial knowledge preserved through movement and memory. The idea that some of the earliest builders thought in planet-wide terms might sound ambitious. Yet, when you look at the evidence scattered across the world, it becomes less about ambition and more about practicality. Early humans who traveled long distances needed reliable ways to navigate. They couldn't rely on written instructions or shared cartographic symbols. They needed the land itself to act as the guide and the sky to act as the clock. Over generations, this necessity could easily evolve into a form of spatial reasoning that, while not recorded on paper, shaped how people viewed their surroundings. They didn't need to visualize the entire Earth to think in large scales. They only needed to track consistent cues and pass those cues down through oral tradition. If a first civilization existed, even in a coastal region now submerged, it might have been among the first to combine local observations into a larger framework. They didn't need advanced mathematics. They only needed patience, repetition, and an understanding that some patterns persist no matter how far you travel. Once that type of thinking seeped into cultural habits, later groups could inherit it, even without realizing they had inherited anything. The result is a set of structures placed across the world that reflect long-term reasoning, not isolated planning. To understand how early humans might have formed planet-wide mental maps, it helps to consider what information they relied on most. The sky, for one, provided a constant framework. The sun rose and set at predictable points along the horizon throughout the year. The stars rotated in ways that could be memorized. The movement of constellations signaled the passage of seasons. The highest point of the sun marked a consistent way to determine one's position relative to the equator, even if ancient people had no concept of latitude. By observing the sky from different locations, early travelers could form a sense of how far they had moved geographically. This type of observation doesn't require instruments. It only requires attention. People who lived nomadic or semi-nomadic lives would naturally accumulate knowledge about how the sky changed as they moved across the land. Over centuries, this knowledge might become sophisticated enough that they could predict horizon events in unfamiliar territories. A solstice sunrise might shift slightly depending on latitude. A constellation might appear higher or lower depending on distance traveled. These shifts are subtle, but humans who relied on the sky as their primary navigation tool would learn to recognize them. With enough experience, they might begin marking locations where certain celestial events appeared in particular ways. A structure aligned to the solstice at one location might reflect similar alignments built elsewhere, creating a web of markers that seem connected across continents, simply because the builders were responding to the same celestial cues. Then there's the movement of people themselves. Early humans didn't stay in small regions. They traveled widely, following rivers, coastlines, and animal migrations. When groups travel regularly between distant points, they begin to internalize the shapes of routes. They learn what lies in each direction. They learn how long it takes to move from one region to another. They begin to think of the land not as a collection of isolated places, but as a continuous surface. Even without writing, they can accumulate a mental map through repeated journeys. If a group followed a route every year, decade, or generation, the route would become stable in cultural memory. And stable routes naturally produce stable measurement systems because people become familiar with the distances between key locations. This sense of distance contributes to the idea of mental maps that extend beyond local boundaries. If early humans knew that one place lay several days' travel east and another lay seasons' travel north, they could begin organizing their understanding of the world in terms of relative positions. Over time, these relative positions become a mental map, not a map with precise lines, but a conceptual one where locations are tied to directions, seasons, and predictable celestial phenomena. Many ancient structures reflect this type of spatial awareness. They're oriented consistently, often in ways that remain meaningful only when viewed across large distances. For example, structures that share similar angles relative to true north might reflect builders working with the same navigational principles. Even if the builders never met, they inherited methods that guided similar choices. These methods act like the grid lines of a mental map. Builders didn't need the full map in their heads. They only needed to follow a consistent framework that naturally spreads the structures along lines that make sense in large-scale terms. Another factor that shaped early planet-wide thinking is the use of natural landmarks. Mountains, rivers, coastlines, and islands often form the basis of early navigation. A mountain visible from far away becomes a dependable reference point. A river flowing in a consistent direction becomes a path that can be followed safely. An island chain forms a sequence of recognizable stops. When people use these natural features consistently, they begin to build their understanding of the world around those features. A group following a river over generations would learn each bend, each tributary, each place where the river widens or narrows. This knowledge becomes a mental map so detailed that people could travel without hesitation. And when they encounter new regions, they compare the new features to the ones they know. If a culture built structures to mark significant parts of these natural maps, the structures themselves become extensions of that mapping system. A stone, placed at a vantage point overlooking a river valley, becomes a marker that helps travelers understand where they are along the route. A structure built at the intersection of two natural paths becomes a reference point that future groups might use even if they don't understand its original purpose. These markers, repeated over generations, form a network of structures that behave like nodes on a broader map. In many regions around the world, ancient structures sit at locations where multiple routes converge. This suggests that the builders were aware of networks of travel that extended far beyond their immediate surroundings. They understood that certain places held significance not just locally, but regionally. They placed markers in spots where travelers could reorient themselves after long journeys. These markers persist in the archaeological record, providing evidence that early humans were thinking beyond small territories. There's also the role of measurement systems. Early people might not have had standardized units of measurement in the modern sense, but they did have consistent methods for estimating distance. They used their bodies, a pace, a stride, the length of an arm. Over time, these units become culturally stable. Even if the units differ between groups, the habit of measuring becomes widespread. Once people measure regularly, they begin to compare distances. They begin to know which places are far and which are close. They begin to develop a sense of proportion between locations. These proportions form the backbone of mental maps. If later groups inherited even fragments of this proportional understanding, they might build structures at distances that reflect those traditional measures. The spacing between ancient sites isn't always precise, but the repetition of similar distances across different regions suggests that measurement was a cultural habit. This reduces the likelihood that the alignments we see today are random. Instead, they reflect early humans working within frameworks that allowed them to visualize regions of the Earth in relation to one another. Another influence on large-scale thinking came from the need to track time across regions. Many early societies relied on seasonal cycles for survival. They needed to know when to plant crops, when to hunt certain animals, when to travel to seasonal gathering places, and when to expect weather changes. These events happen at different times depending on latitude. A group moving north or south across large distances would notice changes in the timing of these seasonal events. Over time, people who traveled frequently would learn how these events shifted. They might even develop early forms of prediction, understanding that certain events happen earlier or later, depending on their position on Earth. When this knowledge becomes widespread, people begin to internalize a sense of large-scale environmental patterns. They begin to see that the Earth isn't uniform. It changes across territory, and that awareness allows them to think in broader terms. They might not have imagined the Earth as a sphere, but they certainly noticed that the world changed in consistent ways across distance. That kind of consistency fosters large-scale reasoning. It's also possible that early humans developed mental maps through repeated trade routes. Goods moved between distant regions long before written history. Obsidian, shells, pigments, and metals traveled across thousands of kilometers through networks of trade that relied entirely on memory and oral tradition. People who managed these routes needed to know the landscape well. They needed to remember dozens of locations and the distances between them. They needed to pass this knowledge to future generations. This creates a cultural foundation for planet-wide spatial thinking. When groups with this type of navigational knowledge begin building permanent structures, those structures reflect the logic of their mental maps. A site might be placed at a point where multiple trade routes intersect. Another might be placed along a boundary between ecological regions. Another might be placed at the exact location where travelers switch from following the stars to following land features. Over time, these structures form a sequence that reflects long-distance reasoning. If a first civilization contributed anything to this tradition, it might have been the initial consolidation of spatial knowledge. A group that lived in a region with predictable seasons and stable coastlines might have developed early methods for tracking celestial movements and distances. When sea levels changed or climate shifts forced migration, these people might have carried their knowledge with them. Even if the original culture disappeared, the knowledge persisted. It spread through descendants who adapted it to new environments. The mental maps they carried became embedded in the placement of structures across the world. When people think about memory, they imagine something internal, a thought stored inside a mind, a story carried in language, a streak of experience that shapes behavior. But long before writing existed, long before symbols or alphabets or carved tablets, memory had to live somewhere else. It had to be placed into the world physically, because nothing else lasted. People forgot, stories faded or changed, generations drifted. The only way to preserve something reliably was to embed it into the environment itself, to let the land hold what human minds could not carry alone. This idea helps explain why so many of the earlier structures appear in places with no obvious practical advantage. Some are built atop windswept hills. Others sit at the edge of deserts far from water. Others stand in valleys surrounded by difficult terrain. People weren't choosing these spots because they were comfortable. They were choosing them because they meant something. The location itself was part of the message. Early humans understood that the earth keeps track of things in a way that people cannot. A hill remains a hill for thousands of years. A river follows roughly the same course across many generations. A mountain peak will be visible long after every spoken story has vanished. These stable features make the landscape a kind of natural archive. The earliest builders didn't leave behind books. They left placements, they left alignments, they left orientations toward things that would still be there centuries later. Those choices weren't accidental. They were attempts to write information into the terrain, not with sentences, but with positions, angles, and relationships to the sky. When you recognize this, ancient structures begin to look less like isolated achievements and more like entries in a long, slowly written record. A record created by people who understood that the land endures. This isn't something people decided suddenly. It grew out of the realities of survival. Humans watched the land closely because they needed it to live. They paid attention to where the sun rose, where water collected, where animals migrated, where seasons arrived first or last. Over time, they learned that the land itself is consistent even when human lives are not. A path walked often becomes easier to walk. A field cleared becomes easier to return to. A marked location remains recognizable even when memory fades. This relationship between humans and landscape shaped how people stored knowledge. They used the earth as a surface that could remember. If a group learned that a certain spot marked the beginning of a season, they might return each year. Eventually, they might place a stone there. The stone isn't the message. The spot is. But the stone ensures that future generations know exactly where to look. If another group learned that a distant cliff signaled a useful direction for travel, they might build something aligned with that cliff. The structure isn't the memory. The alignment is. The structure simply protects the alignment from being forgotten. In this way, early humans externalized their memory. They gave it form in structures that acted as anchors for knowledge that would otherwise vanish. Many ancient sites show signs of being rebuilt repeatedly. A mound layered over an earlier mound, a stone circle expanded or repositioned, a temple constructed on top of a much older one. These layers reveal that the location, not the structure, carried the meaning. People returned because the land held significance. They rebuilt because the place stored something that words could not preserve. Even when culture shifted and stories changed, the memory embedded in the landscape retained enough meaning to draw people back. This repeated return is part of how human memory interacts with Earth's memory. Generation after generation contributes to a place because the place itself acts like a reminder. In some regions, ancient structures appear in long chains stretching across large distances. These chains follow coastlines, valleys, rivers, or paths that would have been used regularly by early travelers. It's possible that each structure acted as a reference point for a different part of a journey. A person doesn't need a drawn map when the land itself has markers. Each marker points to the next, not through words, but through proximity, shape, or alignment. This system of navigation becomes a way of writing direction into the ground, a way of saying, "This is the way," without speaking. Such chains of sites make more sense when you consider how early humans viewed time. Without written calendars, people tracked seasons and cycles through observation of the natural world. If a group knew that a certain point on the horizon marked a solstice sunrise, they might build a structure aligned with it. This alignment becomes a long-lasting seasonal reminder, a way of telling future generations when the world will shift from one state to another. The structure becomes a fixed reference that helps people maintain a sense of time across centuries. When you see how widespread these horizon markers are, you begin to understand how early humans used the landscape to store knowledge about the sky. They were effectively writing the calendar into the earth. A stone aligned to a seasonal sunrise is a marker that will outlast memory. A row of stones pointing toward a particular star embeds astronomical knowledge physically in the ground. If the structure survives, the knowledge survives. And because these alignments remain visible as long as the horizon stays unchanged, they function as a stable record. Most written languages have changed dramatically across thousands of years, but the angle of a sunrise hasn't changed and the horizon hasn't moved. This makes the landscape one of the most stable forms of storage early humans had access to. Some ancient structures also encode knowledge through geometry. These aren't complex shapes, but simple ones: circles, squares, right angles, repeated ratios. When these appear in structures that span wide geographical areas, it suggests that early builders were using geometry not as an abstract study, but as a method for storing information. A circle divided into equal segments can mark time. A rectangle with consistent proportions can reflect solar cycles. A series of stones spaced at regular intervals can record distance. When people created these geometric forms, they weren't drawing diagrams, they were placing information into the world. They didn't have paper, they had land. And land, unlike paper, doesn't decay quickly. This makes geometry a useful tool for embedding memory into the physical environment. If you build something with consistent proportions, those proportions can be recognized long after the original culture disappears. Someone who finds the structure centuries later can still detect the ratios, even if they don't know why they were chosen. In this way, the geometry becomes a silent piece of preserved knowledge. It's also important to consider that early humans didn't view the Earth the way modern people do. Today, most people see the landscape as a backdrop, something that doesn't move, something to be crossed quickly or modified for convenience. But early humans saw it as a full participant in their lives. They listened to it, studied it, responded to it. The land shaped their decisions because it provided the stability that their own lifetimes could not. When every generation experiences the same mountains, the same rivers, the same horizons, it becomes natural to treat the land as something that remembers you as much as you remember it. This reciprocal relationship may not sound scientific, but it's practical. The land does, in its way, remember. A trail remains worn where people have walked for centuries. A riverbed records the floods of past seasons. A hilltop clearing left by early humans can still be found in modern forests. The landscape holds the imprint of human activity long after the people themselves vanish. Early builders understood this intuitively. They may not have thought in terms of geological memory, but they recognized that land keeps shape. And if you place something on that land in a meaningful alignment, the alignment will remain even if the structure falls. This is one reason why many ancient sites appear in places that allow clear views of the horizon, a place where the land remembers. A sunrise alignment is a place where the alignment will stay readable for centuries. A forest can regrow around it. A culture can disappear. But the relationship between the site and the horizon persists. And if future people find the site, they might rediscover the alignment even without knowing what it meant originally. The Earth preserves the relationship because the Earth keeps its shape. The idea of humans writing on the Earth isn't metaphorical. When a structure is placed in alignment with a certain feature, that alignment is a measurable fact. Over time, the collection of these measurable facts becomes a kind of archive. Archaeologists reading the placement of ancient structures aren't reading poetry. They're reading data. They're seeing choices preserved physically across time. And when many structures share similar choices, it suggests that early humans were recording similar information across regions. There's also the possibility that early groups recognized that some forms of knowledge could not be preserved through language alone. Oral stories change rapidly, even within a few generations. But a stone placed to mark a horizon event doesn't change. People might forget the story behind it, but the placement preserves the essential information. It's possible that early humans chose to use physical markers because they understood that knowledge stored in this way had a chance to survive longer than stories. In that sense, structures become a form of intergenerational communication, a message passed between people who will never meet. This communication doesn't need to be detailed. It can be simple. This spot matters. This direction is important. This time of year brings change. When these messages repeat across many sites, the world begins to fill with markers that reflect human understanding of the environment. And when these markers persist for thousands of years, modern observers can see the faint outlines of a very old way of thinking. If a first civilization played a role in this, they may have been among the earliest to encode knowledge into the land through repeated placement. They may have built simple markers along coastlines that later disappeared. They may have used alignments to track seasonal events that became part of cultural tradition. Even if their structures vanished, the habits they established could survive long enough to influence later groups. Over time, the learned behavior becomes a tradition, and the tradition becomes a pattern visible in the archaeological record. In many regions, ancient sites appear in clusters. These clusters often occupy strategic vantage points or places where land features meet in predictable ways. The clustering suggests that early humans knew which locations mattered across long spans of time. They may have recognized that certain places held environmental importance. These places became natural repositories for cultural memory. A site placed there wasn't just a structure, it was an entry in a long record shared by the land and the people who returned to it. When people think about long-lasting civilizations, they often imagine size, large cities, large populations, large armies. But lasting doesn't necessarily depend on size. A group doesn't need to dominate the world to be remembered. They only need to leave something behind that survives longer than they do. Something durable, something that can persist through climate shifts, migrations, cultural changes, and the erosion of stories. When you look at ancient ruins around the world, the ones that survived weren't always the grandest when they were built. Some were simple stone circles, some were low mounds, some were standing stones barely taller than an adult. Yet, they remained because the materials and locations chosen allowed them to outlive their builders. So, when imagining a civilization that truly wanted to be remembered forever, it makes sense to think about what they would prioritize. They wouldn't focus solely on complexity, they would focus on endurance. They would choose methods of communication that require no language to interpret. They would build in ways that allow future humans, thousands of years, distant to rediscover meanings simply by noticing alignments, positions, and repeated forms. A civilization like that wouldn't rely on fragile materials or stories that could be forgotten. They would use the planet itself as their medium. When you look at the oldest surviving structures, they seem to share this principle. They are placed in locations that resist erosion. They use stone rather than wood. They rely on simple geometry rather than elaborate symbols that require interpretation. They align with the sky because the sky doesn't change in ways that erase meaning. It shifts slowly, predictably, and consistently. A structure facing a solstice sunrise today would have faced a similar sunrise thousands of years ago. That gives the placement a stability that no story can provide. This doesn't mean the builders were thinking about us specifically. They weren't imagining people thousands of years in the future, studying their work, but they understood, perhaps intuitively, that the land and sky remain more stable than human memory. If they wanted their structures to last, aligning them to stable features made sense. And when we see these alignments repeated across different sites and different regions, it invites the question of whether the earliest builders were not just constructing for their present moment, but for a future they could not predict. If a civilization truly wanted to ensure they would be remembered forever, they might start by choosing durable locations. A high plateau or mountain ridge is less likely to flood, erode quickly, or be covered by shifting soils. A rocky coastline can survive storm after storm. A sheltered valley can protect structures from wind. Many ancient builders appear to have understood this. Their oldest surviving monuments often occupy places where natural processes would preserve them. Even when entire cultures vanished, these markers remained, touched only by weather. Another priority would be scale. This doesn't mean enormous structures, but structures that are large enough to be noticed even when partially damaged. A small carving can be erased by time. A single wooden pillar disappears quickly, but a ring of stones or a row of massive rocks endures even when weathered. If one falls, the others remain standing. If half of it collapses, the shape is still recognizable. Scale becomes a way to preserve intention even when exact details are lost. But perhaps the most lasting method of all would be placement between multiple fixed references. If a structure aligns with a mountain, a horizon point, and a specific solar event, the alignment becomes a triangle of relationships. Even if the structure deteriorates, the relationships can still be detected. Someone thousands of years later can stand in the same place, look to the same mountain, and observe the same sunrise. The structure becomes a marker not just of presence but of intention. It turns the surrounding environment into part of the message. And because the environment endures, the message endures. When many ancient sites show this kind of alignment, it suggests that early builders might have recognized how powerful relationships between land and sky could be. They might have understood that aligning structures with the natural world would allow the meaning to outlast them. It's not that they expected eternal remembrance, it's that they knew the earth forgets slowly. Another reason to use alignments if a civilization wanted to be remembered is that they don't require literacy to interpret. A person doesn't need to speak the same language or understand the same symbols. They only need to see the sunrise, or notice a mountain peak, or observe the orientation of stones. This universality makes alignments a form of communication that transcends cultural boundaries. If a structure faces the sunrise on a certain day of the year, anyone can rediscover that pattern simply by watching the sky. It doesn't matter what culture they come from. If a group intentionally used this universal method, they could create messages that survive the loss of their language. Even if their stories disappeared, the alignments would remain readable. This makes alignment one of the most powerful ways for early builders to ensure long-term survival of meaning. The structure doesn't need to be explained, it explains itself through its orientation. If a civilization wanted to be remembered forever, they might also rely on repetition. Rather than building one monument, they might build many using similar principles. Or they might establish traditions that encourage future generations to repeat the same patterns in new locations. Repetition across generations creates a chain of structures that preserves a core idea long after the original builders vanish. Even if later people don't know why they're repeating the pattern itself remains. This idea helps explain why so many ancient structures share similar orientations, shapes, and placements. The people who built them weren't necessarily copying each other directly. They might have inherited a tradition whose original meaning had faded, yet the repetition preserved enough of the idea that the pattern remained visible on the landscape. If a first civilization created the earliest version of that tradition, their influence could spread widely, even after they disappeared. Another factor that matters for long-lasting memory is simplicity. Complex messages are fragile. They can be misunderstood or lost. But simple messages like direction, distance, or proportion survive better because they require fewer assumptions. Early builders appear to have understood this. Many ancient structures are based on simple shapes and consistent ratios. These shapes are not decorative. They make the structures easier to reconstruct mentally, even when partially damaged. A circle with missing stones is still recognizable as a circle. A rectangle missing a wall is still a rectangle. Simplicity preserves readability. If a civilization wanted to be remembered forever, they might avoid highly detailed symbols that could lose meaning without context. They would choose forms that remain intelligible as long as vision and spatial reasoning exist. This is exactly what we see in many ancient sites. The forms are simple, intentional, and durable. They might also embed meaning through redundancy. A single alignment can be disturbed by geological shifts, vegetation changes, or structural collapse. But multiple alignments layered together form a more stable framework. If one is lost, others remain. Some ancient structures appear to do exactly this. They align with the sun, with stars, with landmarks, and with geometric principles simultaneously. This redundancy increases the chance that at least part of the message survives. Even if future humans rediscover only one alignment, they uncover a portion of the intention. We don't know whether early builders consciously thought in terms of redundancy, but the effect is visible. Structures that encode multiple relationships are more likely to remain interpretable. This reflection of layered meaning makes them feel as though the builders wanted their work to be understood by people far removed from them in time. If a civilization truly set out to be remembered forever, they might have also chosen to embed part of their identity, not in structures, but in patterns of behavior. If generations repeat the same orientation practices, those practices become cultural memory. Even if the structures vanish, the behavior persists. When a later group builds a new structure using the same methods, they unknowingly preserve part of the older civilization's legacy. This creates a lineage of habits rather than a lineage of monuments. This is one reason why archaeologists sometimes see continuity in building practices across vast stretches of time. The people building later monuments were not trying to commemorate the original builders. They were continuing traditions that felt old and important, even if the reasons had faded. The original civilization, if there was one, would be preserved not in physical form, but in actions that repeated long after memory of the source disappeared. It's also important to consider that permanence doesn't require visibility. A civilization wanting to be remembered forever might not have expected their structures to remain uncovered. They might have understood that time buries things, but buried structures still preserve information. They still preserve alignments, proportions, and spatial relationships. When they're rediscovered, the memory returns. This delayed form of remembrance is common in archaeology. Many structures that were lost for centuries have been uncovered and studied. They still carry meaning because their builders placed them carefully. This suggests that early builders understood permanence differently than modern people. They didn't need constant visibility. They needed predictable rediscovery. If a structure sits in a stable location, aligned with stable environmental cues, it can be found again centuries later. Rediscovery isn't accidental. It's part of the long-term design. Another approach a civilization might take to ensure they are remembered is creating markers that integrate so strongly with the landscape that they cannot be easily separated from it. Carving into bedrock, shaping natural formations, or arranging stones on geological features makes the markers resistant to destruction. They become part of the land rather than objects placed on it. Even if the civilization disappears, the features stay because they follow the shape of the terrain. Many ancient sites use natural features in this way. A structure might incorporate a hill, a ridge, or a natural platform. This reduces the chance that the structure will disappear entirely. Even if human-made components fall, the natural component retains the overall form. This approach allows memory to persist even when erosion and time do their work. If a civilization were truly committed to being remembered forever, they might also rely on distribution. Rather than creating one central monument, they might create many across a large region. This places their legacy in multiple locations with different environmental conditions. Some might be destroyed over time, but others will survive. This distributed memory acts like multiple copies of a message, increasing the chances that at least one version persists. Some early cultures appear to have done exactly this. Their structures span large regions, connected by similar methods of placement. Even when central settlements vanished, the remote markers survived. This distributed approach resembles a network rather than a single statement. And networks endure better because they don't depend on one location. When considering how a civilization might try to be remembered forever, we also have to think about intention. They didn't need to understand geology, climate science, or future archaeological practices. They only needed to recognize durability. A structure made of heavy stones lasts. A structure aligned with predictable sky events remains interpretable. A structure placed in a stable environment avoids erosion. These basic principles are enough to create long-lasting memory without requiring advanced technology. When people first began building permanent structures, they weren't simply responding to their immediate needs. Shelter could be built anywhere. Storage could be created from wood, clay, or earth. But the structures that lasted, those made of stone, aligned with precision, carefully placed on open land or elevated ground, seem to reflect something more than practicality. They appear to mirror something above them. They echo the sky. This doesn't require advanced astronomy or formal study of the heavens. It requires only observation. Anyone who lives outside for most of their life learns the movement of the sun and the rhythm of the seasons. They learn how stars rise and set. They learn the slow shift of constellations across the year. Early humans didn't need telescopes. They had patience, consistency, and a direct relationship with the night sky that most people today never experience. Over thousands of generations, patterns noticed every night become ingrained. They become reliable. They become part of how people understand the world. If a structure is meant to last, aligning it with something that also lasts is a natural choice. The sky, despite its motion, does not behave unpredictably. The sun rises in the east every day. The stars pivot around fixed points in ways that repeat year after year. The moon cycles in a pattern visible to anyone who watches long enough. Early humans didn't need to name these cycles to rely on them. They only needed to observe them. This helps explain why so many ancient structures face specific points along the horizon related to the movements of the sun. A solstice sunrise, for instance, creates a predictable marker that can be observed once a year. By building a structure aligned with that sunrise, early humans created a stable reference point in the landscape. The alignment doesn't fade with language or memory. As long as the horizon remains similar, the sunrise will appear in the same place on the same day every year. Structures that align with the solstice or equinox appear across many different cultures. The people building them spoke different languages, lived in different climates, and had different beliefs. Yet, the repeated choice to orient structures toward these events suggests that the sky provided a shared vocabulary even before cultures diverged. The sky is the one environment that looks similar everywhere, at least in broad terms. People who had no contact might still recognize the same patterns simply because they are universal. Some structures echo not just the sun, but specific stars. A star rising at dawn during a particular season might mark the beginning of a migration period. A star sinking below the horizon might indicate an ideal time for harvesting. Early humans who noticed these shifts could build markers that aligned with star positions to preserve the timing across generations. People who lived with predictable seasonal patterns would naturally attach importance to celestial events because survival depended on recognizing those cues. When archaeologists examine ancient sites, they often find that certain walls, entrances, or corridors face specific points where stars appeared at important times of the year. These alignments are subtle. They don't always involve large openings or dramatic beams of light. Often they are just small angles or carefully placed gaps. But when you see enough of them, you realize that they're not accidental. They reflect careful observation repeated over many generations. A structure aligned to a star is more than a marker of direction. It's a marker of time. If a star that rises at dawn in one season shifts slightly each year, the builders might have known how to track that shift. They might not have understood the astronomical reasons behind it, but they could have recognized the pattern. Observing a sky event consistently enough to embed it in architecture requires commitment. It requires a culture in which people pass observational habits from parent to child. This raises an important idea. Some of the earlier structures might not have been built to echo the sky intentionally. The echo might have emerged naturally from repeated behavior. When people gather in the same place each year to observe a horizon event, they eventually build something there. When people mark a star's rising point with a temporary stake or pole, the habit might grow into something more permanent. Over generations, the habit becomes a structure, and the structure becomes a record of celestial knowledge. One of the more interesting patterns found in ancient architecture involves structures that mirror constellations. In some cases, the placement of buildings or stones roughly matches the arrangement of stars visible overhead. This doesn't necessarily mean the builders were trying to create precise maps of the sky, but it does suggest that they saw a relationship between the land and the heavens. They may have believed that mirroring the sky brought order to their environment. Or they may have simply used the positions of stars as guides for placing structures relative to one another. If a group regularly observed a constellation that served as a reliable seasonal marker, they might have translated its shape into their building layout. This would allow them to preserve the memory of the constellation, even if the stars became harder to see due to weather, smoke, or seasonal changes. The land becomes a stand-in for the sky. The structure becomes a way to keep celestial knowledge accessible. Some sites appear to encode cycles rather than single events. The movement of the moon, for example, follows a more complex rhythm than the sun. Its rising and setting point shift across the horizon in ways that take many years to repeat. Early humans who studied these movements might have embedded the long cycle into arrangements of stones or corridors. A structure that echoes a lunar pattern is effectively storing a long-term calendar into physical space. This requires not only observation, but also generational continuity. People needed to pass down the method of measuring or observing the cycle, even if they didn't fully understand the mechanics. They recognized that the cycle mattered. Structures that reflect long-term cycles help us understand the patience of early observers. They couldn't track a 19-year lunar cycle alone, but if each generation contributed observations, the knowledge could accumulate slowly. The structure becomes a point where long-term memory is preserved. It's not a book, but it functions like one. Another reason ancient structures echo the sky is that celestial patterns provide a universal framework for orientation. If people traveled across long distances, they could use the stars as guides. A group migrating from one region to another might align structures in similar ways, simply because the sky provided familiar reference points. When these alignments appear in structures built by groups with no direct contact, it suggests that early humans relied on the same orientation system because it was reliable everywhere. This is where the idea of a first civilization becomes intriguing. If an early group consolidated some of the earliest forms of celestial observation into tradition, they may have influenced how later groups oriented their structures. Even if the later people didn't know the origins, they repeated the habit. Over time, this repetition could create a network of structures across the world that all echo the same celestial cues. Structures that echo the sky also demonstrate how early humans might have combined memory with environment. A solstice alignment is not just a marker of time, it's a way of anchoring memory to a location. If people return to the same spot each year to observe the sunrise, the place becomes meaningful. After generations of repetition, the meaning becomes part of cultural identity. When someone eventually builds a structure there, it's not just a building. It's a continuation of a long cycle of observation. This relationship between place and sky creates a strong form of memory preservation. People don't need books to remember what matters. They only need to return to a place where the natural world reminds them. The structure acts as a physical prompt. The sky provides the meaning. Together they preserve information far longer than language can. Some structures appear to echo not only the sky, but the cycle of day itself. Corridors, or openings that allow a beam of sunlight to travel along specific walls or floors as the day progresses, suggest that builders were tracking the movement of light with precision. This isn't purely aesthetic. It might have helped people keep track of early, mid, and late seasons. If a sunbeam illuminates a certain spot only during a specific part of the year, it becomes a calendar. The structure records the movement of the sun across seasons through light. This type of architectural design requires a deep understanding of how light enters a structure. Builders needed to know exactly where to place openings and how wide to make them. They needed to understand how shadows behave at different times of day. Early humans who lived close to the rhythms of the sun would have learned this through daily experience. They didn't need formulas. They needed observation. Another pattern found in ancient structures is the use of tilted stones or angled walls that mirror the tilt of the earth. The axial tilt affects how the sun moves across the horizon throughout the year. Some structures appear oriented in ways that reflect this tilt indirectly. For example, the angle of a row of stones might match the angle of the sun's path during a specific season. The alignment might not be precise, but the resemblance is strong enough to suggest that the builders noticed the relationship. Even without understanding planetary mechanics, early humans could have recognized that the sun moves differently throughout the year in predictable ways. They might have incorporated that understanding into structures using angles that help them mark time or identify important seasonal shifts. Structures that echo the sky also reflect how early people conceptualized the world. They didn't divide the environment into separate categories the way modern people do. The sky and the land weren't separate. They were part of a single system. The horizon wasn't just a boundary. It was a canvas where patterns played out daily. The people who built structures that align with these patterns weren't thinking in symbolic terms. They were thinking impractical ones. They were using the sky to create order in their world. This helps explain why ancient sites often show different types of alignments layered together. A single structure might align with a solstice sunrise, a particular star, and a mountain peak. These alignments weren't added for decoration. They were part of a system that allowed early humans to understand time, direction, and season through physical cues. The structure served as a stable reference point for all these cues at once. When many structures across the world echo similar patterns, it suggests that people in early human history saw the world in similar ways. They had to. Survival depended on recognizing the rhythms of the environment, and the environment is shaped by the sky. If a first civilization contributed to this way of seeing, their influence might not have been in exact knowledge, but in approach. They might have established early practices of observation that others continued. Even if the specifics changed, the habit remained over time. This habit produces structures that look related, even when separated by thousands of years. The builders weren't copying each other, they were responding to the same part of the natural world. The sky gave them a common reference that transcended cultural differences. When you look at the remains of the oldest structures in the world, you might assume that stone is the most reliable way to preserve the past. Stone feels solid. It feels stable. It feels like the kind of material that should carry information across long stretches of time without losing shape. Yet, when we look further back into history, we find that stories often last longer than structures. They cross continents through memory. They change and adapt across cultures. They shift in meaning, but they survive in some form. Meanwhile, many physical structures, once impressive, once important, have vanished entirely. They eroded, collapsed, or were buried. Entire cities were lost until someone rediscovered them by accident. But stone has its own kind of endurance. Even when stories outlast structures in memory, the stones that do remain can preserve information that stories cannot. They store alignments, distances, proportions, and relationships with the environment. Stories shift. Stone holds the same position for centuries. These two forms of memory, story, and structure seem different, but they work together. They complement each other. Understanding how they interact helps explain why ancient builders might have relied on both, even if they didn't think of it as a conscious decision. Stories have shaped human life from the earliest days. People told stories to pass on knowledge about dangerous animals, reliable water sources, useful plants, and seasonal changes. Because each generation repeated the same stories, they lasted even if the details shifted slightly. A story might change in its characters or the exact events described, but the essential message would remain. If a story warned people about a floodplain, the narrative might become more dramatic over time, but the warning remains strong enough to protect future generations. Stone works differently. A structure built on high ground near a floodplain doesn't warn in words. It warns through presence. It shows that people once chose that location carefully. It suggests that building lower on the plain might be unsafe. But without a story to explain why the structure sits where it does, the meaning becomes uncertain. Stone holds facts, but not interpretation. Stories hold interpretation, but not always facts. Early humans didn't choose between the two. They used both because both were necessary. If a first civilization existed, even in a form much smaller than we imagine, they would have understood this relationship simply through experience. If a group built something durable on the land, they needed a story to explain why the structure mattered. Without the story, the structure's purpose would fade. But if a story mentioned a place repeatedly, the place gained significance even if the original structure wore down over time. This balance between spoken memory and physical memory may have been one of the earliest systems for preserving knowledge. Many cultures carried their history orally long before they built in stone. Oral traditions could survive thousands of years across migrations. They could weaken, transform, or fragment, but they continued because each generation saw value in retelling them. By contrast, stone only begins to preserve information after people decide to shape it. Even then, it can break, shift, or disappear if environmental forces act on it strongly enough. The seeming strength of stone doesn't guarantee survival. It simply increases the odds. But even when stone structures fall, the people who once built them might continue telling stories about the locations they marked. This interplay shows up in how ancient sites are rediscovered. Often the first hints of a lost structure come from stories passed down in communities long after the physical evidence vanished from sight. People might speak of an old gathering place, an old boundary marker, an old path that once mattered. When archaeologists follow these stories, they sometimes uncover ruins that match the descriptions. In these cases, the stories outlasted the stone. Even if the structure deteriorated to the point of being invisible, the story preserved enough memory for people to find it again. Yet, once a structure is found, it can reveal details no story preserved. The alignment might show when people gathered there. The stones might show how they measured distance. The placement might indicate which horizon event mattered most. These pieces of information are rarely found in oral stories because stories focus on meaning, not mechanics. They explain why, not how. Stone preserves the how. This dual preservation is one reason why early people may have relied on physical markers, even if they already had strong oral traditions. Stories tend to spread more widely than structures. People migrate. They travel. They encounter new environments. They adapt their stories to fit new circumstances. This flexibility allows stories to outlast the places where they originated. A group might leave a region entirely, but still carry knowledge embedded in stories about the landscape. The stories evolve, perhaps losing specific references, but they preserve the core lessons. This persistence makes oral tradition one of the most resilient forms of human memory. Stone, on the other hand, remains fixed in place. A structure cannot move with a migrating group. It cannot adapt to new surroundings. Once built, it relies on others to return to it. If people stop visiting the site, the structure's purpose becomes harder to interpret. If a region becomes uninhabitable, the structure may be abandoned altogether. But even if forgotten, it remains as long as environmental conditions allow. Centuries or millennia later, someone might uncover it accidentally, and suddenly the stone reveals something that no living story remembered. This disconnect between mobility and permanence creates interesting patterns in the archaeological record. Some structures stand alone with no stories attached to them. Some stories describe events or places that no longer have visible physical evidence. This separation isn't a failure. It's simply the result of two different systems working across different timescales. Stories travel well. Stone anchors well. Neither can fully replace the other. If early humans recognized this, even in simple ways, they might have intentionally used both methods to preserve important information. A group might build a structure to mark a horizon event and simultaneously develop a story to explain why that event mattered. The story would help people remember to return to the site. The site would help preserve knowledge even if the story changed. Some ancient cultures appear to have relied heavily on this combination. In certain regions, myths about celestial beings correspond closely with structures aligned to specific stars. The people repeating the myths might not have known the exact astronomical details embedded in the structure, but the myth kept the location significant. The structure kept the alignment accurate. Together, they preserve the full meaning across generations. This is part of what makes ancient structures feel so connected to the sky. As explored earlier, the alignments offer physical memory. The myths offer interpretive memory. Each reinforces the other. When either fades, the knowledge becomes harder to understand. But as long as one survives, some part of the original intention remains. It's also relevant to consider that stories allow for emotional preservation. People remember things more easily when they care about them. A story that inspires, warns, or comforts has a better chance of being passed down than a technical description of a solstice alignment. As a result, stories can outlast details that were once considered essential. But when the physical structure still stands, those details can be reconstructed through modern study. For example, a story might describe a place where light once touched the heart of the stone. The emotional phrasing survives because it's vivid. The technical meaning that a beam of sunlight reached a specific point only on certain days might be forgotten. But when modern observers study the structure, they rediscover the alignment. The story preserved the significance, the stone preserved the mechanism. This interplay suggests that early humans might have relied on stories to preserve context, and stone to preserve data. They didn't think in these terms, but the effect is similar. Neither method alone can preserve everything, but together they create a more complete form of memory. Another dimension to consider is how stories change when people move. Migration is a natural part of human history. Groups travel for food, climate, safety, or opportunity. When they move, they carry their stories with them. But they cannot carry their structures. A story about a sacred mountain might travel hundreds of kilometers from its original location, changing gradually until the mountain becomes symbolic rather than literal. Meanwhile, the original structure built near that mountain remains, even if no one remembers why it was important. This divergence can make it difficult to connect stories with structures accurately, but it also highlights how stories keep cultural identity intact even when geography changes. A migrating group might forget the exact location a story referred to, but they remember the meaning. This ability to preserve meaning across distance is something stone cannot do. On the other hand, when people remain in one region over long periods, stone becomes an even stronger form of memory. Structures placed in consistent locations become landmarks for many generations. They become part of the landscape itself. Children grow up seeing them. Adults reference them. Elders use them as teaching tools. When stories attach to these structures, the combination becomes powerful. Place and narrative reinforce each other. The structure provides a stable anchor. The story provides continuity. This creates a cycle in which people return to the same spots year after year, sometimes for reasons they no longer fully understand. They may perform rituals or gatherings at these locations simply because it has always been done. The original meaning might have faded, but the combination of story and stone keeps the practice alive. This pattern appears in many ancient cultures. It suggests that early builders understood how to create physical anchors for long-term cultural behavior. If a first civilization wanted to preserve its influence, even unintentionally, they might have relied on this combination. They might have created structures in key locations and passed down stories explaining their importance. Later groups would inherit the stories and continue visiting the sites, even if they modified the practices or added new interpretations. Over time, the original stories might fade, but the structures would remain, and the new stories would continue to preserve the significance of the location. Eventually, the stories might separate entirely from the original builders. People might believe the structures were made by giants or gods or ancestors far older than they actually were. But even these new stories preserve the idea that the structure matters. As long as the stories keep people returning, the structure's meaning remains accessible. And as long as the structure remains standing, the stories have a reference point that prevents them from drifting too far from the physical reality. This is why some of the most ancient sites in the world still hold cultural meaning today. People may not know who built them or why, but they treat them as important. The combination of stone and story has preserved enough significance to keep the sites active parts of human experience. When you stand in front of a ruin today, whether it's a circle of weathered stones, an arrangement of carved blocks on a hillside, or the broken outline of an old platform perched on a ridge, it's almost impossible to see it the way the people who built it once did. You're arriving at the very end of a long story without access to the earlier pages. The people who shaped the stones are gone. The sounds of their tools vanished. The voices that explained the purpose faded out of existence long before the first written records began. All that remains is a shape in the land, stripped of its context, waiting for interpretation that can only be partial. And yet, when we look at these ruins with modern eyes, we bring an enormous amount of information they did not have. We know about geology, climate shifts, erosion rates, and population movements. We have maps that show terrain from above. We use satellites to see the alignment of structures over vast distances. We can measure angles and distances with precision unavailable to ancient builders. This combination of missing context and new perspective creates an unusual tension. We see more and less at the same time. We understand things the builders never could have predicted, but we also miss things they once thought were obvious. This duality shapes how modern people interpret ruins. What we see depends on our expectations, our knowledge, and our limitations. The first thing many people notice when they encounter an ancient structure is the craftsmanship. Even the simplest stone arrangement, when placed carefully, looks intentional. The intention is unmistakable. Stones don't stack themselves. A path doesn't straighten itself. A mound doesn't form a perfect line without repeated human effort. This intention signals that the people who built the ruin were paying attention. They weren't improvising. They were following rules that made sense in their world. But modern eyes often struggle to imagine what those rules were. Some ruins appear designed around practical needs that we understand immediately. Defensible positions, access to water, fertile land. Others do not. When a structure sits far from resources or seems oriented toward a horizon point rather than a settlement, modern viewers search for meaning. Sometimes we assume spiritual or ceremonial significance. Other times we assume astronomical alignments. In reality, the meaning might have been a combination of several things. Ancient people rarely built single-purpose structures. Their lives were too interconnected for that. A place could be practical, symbolic, and observational at the same time. But modern categories separate these functions in ways that ancient people did not. This tendency to categorize shapes how ruins appear to us. When we see a structure aligned with the sun, we assume astronomical intention. When we see one place near water, we assume practical intention. But early humans didn't divide their world into practical and spiritual, or symbolic and functional. Everything in their environment had multiple layers of meaning. A sunrise alignment could help guide seasonal migration, but it could also carry cultural significance. A platform built on high ground could serve as a lookout, a gathering place, and a reference point for celestial events. Modern viewers tend to separate these possibilities. Ancient builders likely combine them without distinction. Another factor that complicates modern interpretation is distance. When ancient people looked at their structures, they didn't see ruins. They saw active parts of their environment maintained and used regularly. They saw vibrant colors, fresh carvings, recently placed stones. They saw a site alive with gatherings, rituals, trade, or seasonal observations. Modern viewers see what time is stripped away. The absence of activity can make the original purpose harder to imagine. A place that once held sound, movement, and intention now sits silent, and silence can give the impression that the structure was meant to be mysterious. This impression can lead modern observers to attribute meanings that might not reflect the builder's intentions. We might interpret structure as an ancient puzzle simply because its obvious function no longer survives in the visible ruins. A path once used for gathering might look ceremonial. A storage platform might look spiritual. A navigational marker might look symbolic. The lack of context makes it easy to misinterpret what's left behind. Another challenge comes from the scale of information modern people have. Because we have access to satellite imagery, we can see patterns impossible for ancient people to see from the ground. We can draw lines across continents, identifying alignments between sites that the builders likely never considered together. This doesn't mean those alignments are meaningless. It means the builders experienced the world differently. They didn't see their structures from above. They saw them from within their environment, shaped by local terrain, visibility, and daily needs. Their view is grounded. Ours is aerial. This change in perspective creates moments where we see connections that might be real but unintentional. For example, if two sites align in a straight line across hundreds of kilometers, it could reflect a shared tradition of orientation. It could also reflect coincidence emerging from the sheer number of ancient structures across the world. Modern tools make patterns easier to find whether they were intended or not. This doesn't weaken the patterns. It simply means we need to consider both possibilities. Modern eyes can see too much and too little at the same time. Another aspect of modern interpretation is the influence of modern expectations. People today often assume that ancient builders thought in simple terms because they lacked modern tools. But ancient people were excellent observers. They had to be. Their survival depended on recognizing environmental cues. They learned how the sky moved because they watched it every night. They learned how shadow shifted because they lived outdoors more often than not. They understood their landscape not as a backdrop, but as a living system they interacted with constantly. When modern people visit a ruin, they might bring assumptions that underestimate this observational ability. We imagine ancient builders needed advanced instruments to create precise alignments. We tend to forget how much precision can be achieved with careful observation over many years. When we realize that a structure aligns perfectly with a solstice sunrise, we sometimes interpret it as extraordinary. In reality, the builders might have achieved it through simple, repeated observation across generations. Modern eyes also tend to focus on what remains, not what's missing. A ruin is often only the foundation of a once larger structure. Walls that stood several meters tall may now be reduced to a few scattered stones. Roofs that once existed are gone. Wooden supports decayed long ago. Decorative elements vanished centuries before the first modern archaeologist arrived. This absence can change the apparent purpose of a site. A place that once housed families might now look like an empty ceremonial platform. A structure that once served as a meeting hall might now appear like an isolated arrangement of stones. This incomplete nature of ruins means modern interpretations are always provisional. They can be refined with new discoveries, but they can rarely be confirmed with absolute certainty. This doesn't make the interpretations useless. It simply highlights that modern viewers see ancient structures through the lens of what survived, not what existed. Another factor shaping modern interpretation is our tendency to search for complexity. Modern people often assume that ancient structures must have hidden meanings, coded messages, or elaborate symbolism. While some structures may indeed contain complex alignments or geometric precision, not every aspect of ancient architecture was designed for deep meaning. Some choices were practical, some were aesthetic, some were traditional. When we assume complexity everywhere, we risk missing the simpler aspects of ancient life. On the other hand, modern viewers sometimes underestimate the sophistication of ancient builders. We assume that early people lack the ability to track long-term cycles. Yet, structures built to reflect lunar cycles, which require observation over decades, demonstrate patience and knowledge that modern people rarely practice. The modern view often pivots between assuming too much and too little complexity. The truth usually lies somewhere in between. Modern interpretation is also shaped by cultural stories. Today, people bring different beliefs to their understanding of ancient ruins. Some interpret ruins through scientific frameworks, looking for measurable alignments and evidence of environmental adaptation. Others interpret them through cultural or spiritual frameworks, seeing them as expressions of early belief systems. Some approach ruins with skepticism, assuming randomness. Others approach with reverence, assuming intentionality. All of these perspectives color the way modern people see ancient structures. The challenge is not to eliminate these perspectives, it's to recognize that no single viewpoint captures the full truth. Ancient builders weren't motivated by only one factor. They were influenced by environment, tradition, practical needs, observation, cultural meaning, and long-term habits. Modern interpretations that focus on only one dimension risk flattening the full complexity of early human thought. Modern eyes also bring an awareness of time that ancient builders did not have. We know that thousands of years separate us from the people who built these structures. We know about eras, civilizations, climate ages, migrations, extinctions, and geological changes. This awareness shapes how we view ruins. When we see a stone placed in a precise alignment, we immediately connect it to long-term cycles. Ancient people might have understood the cycle intuitively, but not historically. Their world wasn't divided into ages. It was continuous. Every sunrise belonged to the same world. Every season followed the last. This difference in temporal awareness means modern viewers might interpret ancient structures as deliberately designed to span millennia, when the builders might have been thinking only in terms of generations. This doesn't diminish their achievement. It simply reminds us that lasting structures don't always emerge from long-term planning. Sometimes they emerge from short-term needs, solved with durable materials. Another factor shaping modern interpretation is technology. Today we can use ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR, and 3D modeling to reveal details hidden beneath soil, vegetation, or collapsed stones. These tools can reveal that what appears to be a simple arrangement of stones is actually the visible part of a much larger structure. They can show pathways, platforms, and buried walls that reshape our understanding of the site. Modern eyes can see beneath the ground in ways ancient people did not anticipate. This gives us a more complete picture of the structure, but also raises new questions about how the builders envisioned it. These technologies also reveal that many ancient sites were connected as part of larger networks. Roads, trade routes, seasonal pathways, and shared traditions created regional systems that modern viewers might not notice without technological aid. When we see these networks, we might assume that ancient builders intentionally designed large-scale systems. In some cases, they may have. In others, the networks might have emerged naturally from repeated use rather than deliberate planning. What modern eyes often fail to see is the everyday nature of ancient life. Ruins make ancient people seem distant, almost unreachable. But the people who built these structures lived lives filled with routines, tasks, and decisions similar in many ways to modern life. They cared for families. They responded to weather. They adjusted plans based on available materials. They learned from elders. They made mistakes and corrected them. Seeing ruins as mysterious monuments can obscure the lived experiences that shaped them. Modern interpretation also struggles to see the uncertainty ancient builders faced. When we look at a structure aligned with the solstice, we assume the builders were confident in their knowledge. But they were observing the sky without written records or precise tools. Their methods relied on patience and trial and error. What appears precise today may have emerged gradually through repeated adjustments. This human aspect is easy to overlook when examining ruins that seem flawless. When people think about ancient civilizations, especially the earliest ones, the imagination often jumps to dramatic possibilities. Secret knowledge, lost cities, advanced abilities hidden in ruins. But if we bring the same calm, measured approach we've followed throughout this journey, the idea becomes something different, less dramatic, more grounded, less about impossible achievements, more about understanding how early humans tried to make sense of their world. And if we imagine, even gently, that a first civilization once existed, whether as a small coastal culture that flourished long before known history, or as a widespread tradition that left its influence through habits more than monuments, the question becomes quieter. If they left a message, what would they want future people to know? This isn't a question about codes or encrypted knowledge. It's about intention. Early humans who shape stones, align structures, and mark the land weren't thinking in modern terms of communication. They weren't writing for archaeologists or scientists thousands of years in the future, but they did understand that the earth holds memory long after voices fade. And if they place something deliberately, it's because it mattered enough to be remembered, at least for a while. When we look at the oldest structures, the simplest patterns become the most consistent. Alignments with the sun, connections with the horizon, stones placed in ways that reflect seasonal cycles, simple shapes repeated across different regions. None of these things feel like attempts to impress. They feel like attempts to orient, to guide, to stabilize a relationship between people and their environment. If the earliest builders left a message, it might not have been a sentence or an idea. It might have been a reminder, something like, pay attention to what repeats, pay attention to what stays the same. This kind of message isn't written in words, it's written in behavior. When early people returned to the same spot year after year to watch a sunrise touch a stone, they were doing something more than observing an astronomical event. They were reinforcing the importance of consistency. They were saying to future generations, without saying anything at all, that the cycles of the world can be trusted. They show when the seasons change. They show when the cold begins or ends. They show when to plant, when to travel, when to gather. These cycles anchor human life. They were the first reliable clocks. If the first civilization wanted to communicate across time, choosing the sky as the medium makes sense. Even without writing, even without direct instruction, future people would look at the same stars, the same sun, the same horizon. And if those people found stones aligned to those patterns, they could rediscover the meaning simply by waiting and watching. This is a message that survives independently of language. It doesn't require interpretation. It only requires attention. Another message the earliest builders might have wanted to pass on is the importance of place. Many ancient structures aren't just aligned with the sky. They're tied to specific features in the landscape: a mountain peak, a river bend, a slope that allows a clear view of the horizon. These choices weren't random. A place becomes meaningful when people return to it repeatedly, when generations gather there, when the land becomes part of how a community understands itself. The earliest builders might have been reinforcing the idea that certain places matter because they reveal something consistent. A specific horizon point might show a solstice sunrise. A certain hill might mark the approach of seasonal rains. A valley might echo sound in a predictable way, allowing gatherings to take place effectively. If the first civilization left a message through these choices, it might have been something like, choose your places carefully. Let the land teach you. Let the environment guide you. These ideas aren't extraordinary. They're practical, but they carry the kind of practicality that lasts across generations. Early people couldn't rely on written instructions. They relied on habits passed down orally and physically. The structures themselves acted as reminders of those habits. Another kind of message the earliest builders might have intended involves connection. Not connection in a mystical sense, but connection through repetition. When people built structures facing similar directions or using similar shapes, it created continuity across regions. They might not have understood that they were contributing to something larger, yet the effect is the same. Repeated choices form patterns. These patterns become recognizable to modern observers, but in their time, they might have served as a way for people to feel connected to traditions older than they were. Imagine a group building a new structure in a place that felt significant. They might orient the stones the way their grandparents did. They might divide the circle into segments that reflect familiar cycles. They might repeat measurements that feel right because they're traditional. Over centuries, this behavior embeds consistency into the landscape. If a first civilization influenced those traditions early on, the continuity could be seen across regions and millennia. The message then might have been less about content and more about habit. Something like, remember the cycles, remember the patterns, continue what works. Don't lose track of how the world behaves. If we explore another angle, the first civilization might have wanted to communicate stability. Early life was uncertain. Weather could shift quickly. Food sources varied. Water sources changed. But the movement of the sun and the stars stayed steady. Stone placed carefully resisted change. A structure aligned with the horizon might have given people a sense of reliability in a world full of unpredictability. If the earliest builders wanted to leave behind anything for future generations, it might have been a demonstration that stability is possible, that some things can endure, that the world can be understood through patient observation. They didn't need to articulate this. The stones themselves demonstrate it. A structure that remains intact for centuries shows that humans can create something that lasts longer than memory, that human efforts can persist even when most other things change. Another possibility is that the first civilization wanted to mark something about scale. Not the scale of the Earth as a sphere or the scale of continents, but the scale of human presence. When early people built on high ground or along prominent landscapes, they weren't necessarily trying to dominate the environment. They were anchoring themselves in it. A visible structure says, "We were here, we shaped this place, we paid attention to how the world works." If future people find this, they will know that we existed and cared enough to build something that mattered to us. This message can be found in many ancient sites. Structures that seem modest in their original form become significant once time removes everything else. A ring of stones becomes a sign of early presence. A carved rock becomes evidence of deliberate thought. A row of stones pointing toward a mountain shows someone noticed the alignment and wanted future people to notice it too. These things outlast the stories that explained them, but the stones themselves still carry meaning. If the first civilization wanted to communicate something more personal, they might have tried to preserve knowledge about cycles that took a long time to observe. A single generation can track a year's seasons, but it takes many generations to observe long cycles, those involving lunar patterns or multi-year celestial shifts. If early people learned these cycles over centuries, they might have built markers to record them. These markers allow future generations to rediscover the same patterns, even if memory fades. The message in that case would be something like, "Pay attention to the long cycles. They matter. They influence weather, tides, seasons, migrations. They shape life on Earth." Even without writing, people could encode this knowledge into the placement of stones. Alignments that require decades to confirm show patience. They show commitment to understanding how the world behaves over long periods. This type of message would be especially valuable to people living close to the land, where knowledge of long-term cycles could determine survival. Another angle to consider is the idea of shared experience. The first civilization, if it existed, likely didn't imagine itself as ancient or unique. They simply lived their lives and responded to their environment. But they might have understood that future generations would experience similar challenges: hunger, weather, movement, learning, building. If they wanted to leave something for those future people, it would likely be grounded in universal human experience rather than specific instructions. Such a message might not have been about specific information, but about perspective. Something like, observe carefully, build carefully, choose durable materials, learn from the sky, trust patterns that repeat. These are general ideas, but they have shaped human development in ways that transcend specific cultures. Looking at the larger scale possibilities, the first civilization might have wanted to communicate that the world is connected, not in a vast dramatic way, but in the simple sense that what happens in one place can be observed in another. The sun rises everywhere, the stars wheel overhead everywhere, the seasons shift everywhere, though at different times depending on location. People living far apart still experience the same cycles. If early builders mark these cycles in different regions, the repetition becomes a kind of connection across distance. If a faraway group discovers a marker that aligns with the sun in the same way as a distant structure, they might feel part of something larger. Even if the original builders didn't intend such a large-scale message, the effect of repeated patterns across regions creates one. It says, "We all observe the same sky. We all rely on the same cycles. We all respond to the same patterns." This might be one of the most powerful messages ancient builders unintentionally left behind. Finally, we can imagine a simpler message, something that requires no specific interpretation, something that exists without needing words or context. When early people placed stones in the ground and returned to them year after year, they were telling future generations, "We were here and we cared about understanding the world." Even if everything else changes, even if stories vanish, even if cultures disappear, those stones remain as evidence of continuity. They show that long before modern knowledge, long before writing, long before complex societies, humans tried to learn the rhythms of the world and leave something behind that would outlast them. If the first civilization left a message, it probably wasn't grand, it probably wasn't elaborate. It was likely something deeply human. Remember the cycles. Pay attention to the land and keep track of what endures. A message not meant to impress, but to guide. A message emerging from observation, repetition, and the desire to make sense of a world too large to understand in a single lifetime. And as this long journey through ancient structures, early patterns, and the persistence of memory comes to a close, the message remains steady. The people who lived long before us weren't trying to speak across thousands of years. They were trying to understand their present by anchoring it to things that do not change: the sky, the land, the cycles, the stones. And because those things endure, a small piece of their intention endures with them, waiting quietly for anyone willing to pay attention long enough to notice.